Ms. Eno?
Here.
Ms. Wolf?
Here.
Ms. Hartman?
Here.
Mr. Adam?
Here.
Mr. Williams?
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty Justice for all.
Is there a CEO's report? Then we will begin our budget session. We are breaking this out today by functional group. I will be especially lenient by request on public comment, especially since the public comment period is also going to be used by department heads when appropriate.
Yeah, Chair Williams, members of the board, prior to getting started with the presentations, we do have 2 requests to speak under general public comment. And we're going to start with Ed Kolaski and then hear from Andy Caldwell.
Thank you. Good morning. We've been trying to remodel our house for the last 4 years. The Board of Architectural Review stated that our second story is solely over the garage, when you can clearly see it's over the garage, the kitchen, the dining room, the laundry room, and part of the living room. But their ruling, therefore, we cannot remodel our house. It's as simple as that. We have a corrupt government in the 2nd District, and we have to deal with it. I call my talk today, Who Represents Me? Clearly no one here represents me. Is this what we live for? So that we can come down here and complain about a corrupt government and they can't explain this and they can't tell you why? Do they need some additional money? You know, Spiro Agnew always got a little extra under the table. Is that what's required here? I'm retired now. Oof. And this is what I come down here for? I don't come down here to berate the S-Bar, as pointed out by one of the supervisors here in the 2nd District. Why would I come down here to berate S-Bar? No, I come down here because S-Bar, in particular Alex Pujoa, is doing things that are illegal. You know, when I first started this, I thought, geez, the supervisor's going to be embarrassed by this. It's going to be a shame. Isn't there something that can be done? And why is he still at S-Bar? And why is he still chairman of the board downstairs? Isn't it about time for some change? I mean, I've listed 14 items on this page. You want to flip to the other one there? And 14 up there of violations of California law and federal law. You're not allowed to kick someone out of an audience, especially if they paid for the meeting. Yet we were kicked out in 15 seconds. We weren't allowed to speak. They had somebody jump up and scream at us. We weren't even allowed to show our project. I paid for that? You guys should be ashamed. Isn't there any honesty in this? You know, I had so many things here. Janet Wolf stated, well, berate her, not S-Bar. Well, Janet Wolf didn't kick us out of the meeting. She didn't tell us, don't show your drawings. She didn't tell you, get out of here. We don't want to see it. It was Alex downstairs, and there are numerous other things. They erased the recording of the meeting. They changed the minutes. You know, in that meeting that was 15 seconds, they got a write-up that's yay long about things that we never did. We never changed this, they said. We added 300 square feet to a 400 square foot project. That represented no changes. This is what you requested. And all the other 4 meetings, we did what they ever requested, and we got a 5-2 vote in our favor, a straw vote. All we had to do was make it so it's so not solely over the garage. And we did that. And what did we get? We got kicked out of the meeting. This is disgusting. And Janet Wolf doesn't know, and yet she's on the board here. You're going to decide budget matters? For 4 years and 44 talks, she doesn't know what I was talking about? Thank you.
Mr. Caldwell?
Chair Williams, members of the board, I'm Andy Caldwell representing CoLab. I want to explain to you why over the last 20 plus years we've at least attempted to read the county budget cover to cover. I didn't quite make it this year because I got it a little bit late, but I'm still glad to have got it. Years ago, when we started our organization, our #1 mission was to save jobs. It was to save manufacturing and industrial jobs in this region. I'm an example of somebody that went to college but couldn't get a job. Even back in 1980, a Bachelor of Arts degrees were a dime a dozen. I applied for a county job for $13,000 a year, and there was 300 applicants. And I went and got a job in manufacturing, working straight graveyards, making more than that. And I stayed in the industry. I ended up staying there for 11 years. In the end, I had been promoted, and I was dealing with regulatory programs as well as industrial relations for Union Sugar, which had been here for 90 years. And our company was hurting for a number of reasons, primarily because of a shift of ag from beets to a bunch of other crops. And anyway, I was sitting there one day interviewing somebody. I didn't speak Spanish, and speakers because we had enough people that were bilingual. And I realized I'm part of the American dream here. I'm giving this guy a job. This guy's going to go from a field to a factory, from seasonal to year-round, no benefits to benefits. And we've got a bazillion people out here earning a middle income with maybe a high school education or less. And my views started to change. And then I saw it coming in the form of the regulatory programs and the fees for those programs. And I came across a quote, and this quote is what caused me to quit that job. I was offered a promotion from Holly Sugar, and I quit it to help start a nonprofit. Life in Santa Barbara County includes limiting opportunities for others. It limits economic mobility, but that is a legitimate political choice. We've failed in the last 28 years that I've been doing this to stave off that crushing blow to upward mobility to what is now a permanent urban underclass. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. Thank you.
That concludes public comment.
Has to stay.
We have an introduction to the budget.
Good morning, board members. So we begin this year's budget hearings with hope. We have a balanced budget. We have no layoffs. We continue commitments and priorities. We've restored or partially all the proposed service, but we also caution and prudence. It's the worst disaster we've seen from it physically and financially. But the presented today to do the most important things well, given your board's priorities, policies, and direction as we next year's budget and beyond. So before we thank all the departments, you and all your fiscal officers and your staff for working all year round, and there's also been revenue increases, and that is how we got to a balanced budget before you. The past used guiding principles to guide us as we developed and these principles in developing the recommended budget. Key considerations. Overall, we continue to see expenditures outpacing revenue growth overall in the budget, and Jeff will talk about that. First year of implementing a program for cannabis regulation in the county, so the recommended budget includes expenses and revenues in that regard. We continue to recover from the disasters, and that will be a multi-year process working with FEMA and our partner agencies. We're continuing to adapt to state and federal mandates, which change yearly. We're continuing to work on a challenging situation, as that is addressing the mentally ill, not just in the criminal justice system, but outside the criminal justice system, and trying to make sure that our technology is up to date to meet expectations and to ensure that we're an efficient organization. Significant updates since the publication of the recommended budget. The governor has released the May revise, and the voters have passed the cannabis tax ballot measure. In addition, not mentioned here is that we have approved now 5 pension sharing agreements with our bargaining units. We still have more to do, but this will help contain future pension costs and share the risk of future increases with our employees. Challenges ahead. As new revenue becomes available, we should be mindful and consider our existing needs before entertaining significant new expansions. This list is just a reminder of some of the needs we've discussed with the board in the past, ranging from public safety communication needs, unfunded CIP needs, our growing maintenance, changing regulations, employee costs to stay competitive, as I said before, demands to keep pace with technology, and continuing threat of natural disasters. We continue also with Renew 22. Next fiscal year will be year 2 of Renew 22, and we'll continue to build a better organization so that we can move we can continue to be financially sustainable and an agile organization to address any future disasters, uncertainties, and to meet your board's highest priorities. The theme for this budget is renewal and resilience, and it acknowledges the need for renewal with Renew 22 and the need for resilience to maintain a viable and strong organization. This budget attempts to make trade-offs of the short and longer-term needs, better align services and costs, and take opportunities to do new ways of doing business so we can consistently do the most essential, important things well. With that, I'm going to hand off now to Jeff Frappwell, who will give a more detailed summary of the recommended budget.
Chair Williams, members of the board, it's my pleasure to present the budget summary for the upcoming fiscal year. As we look at our hearings going forward, the first four bullet points of the agenda are the material that I will cover initially, and then we'll have time for the functional group summaries and department presentations if your board requests or there's need. We'll look at the closing, the financial challenges ahead, reiterate those, move into board deliberations and recommended actions. Let me just summarize quickly what you have in front of you in your board hearing materials binder. And all this material is also available on the web as well. But in tabs 1, you have our board letter and hearing schedule. 2, the board inquiry forms. These are inquiries that your board has made to us with respect to the recommended budget. We've attempted to respond to those. Incorporated in tab 2 are also some board inquiry forms left over from the workshops. Those have been incorporated in this binder as well. Tabs 3 and 4 really are the adjustments as well as the different schedules, prior adopted expansions, as well as the final board adjustments, attachment E. Tab 5 is a summary of the ongoing grants and ongoing contracts for your board's consideration. Tab 6, the budget resolution, salary resolution, as well as the position allocation changes that have taken place during the current fiscal year. In tab 8, we have our resolutions and board letter related to the successor agency for the former Isla Vista RDA. And then finally, in tab 9, we have the budget summary and overview that we're going over currently. And tabs 10 to 32 are the departmental specific presentation materials.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Janet?
Thank you. Mr. Frappwell, we got a new addition to our binder for attachment F. That was the one with all the employees listed. And it was difficult to see what the difference was in going through it. Can you just point out what the new information was?
Right. Attachment F. The
maybe you can let us know. Oh.
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, it was the only revision there was within the Sheriff's Department there is a need to move the pilot position, and that's all the only change. There's no net budgetary impact for that.
Okay, thank you very much.
The recommended budget, in a quick summary, is, as Mona mentioned, a balanced budget. We have $1,101.7 in operating revenues, 1103.9 as our expenses. The 2.2 is our net operating impact. These are funds that essentially received in the current year that were not spent will roll over into next fiscal year. Our staffing has increased to 4,167 positions, FTEs, in the budget. As Mun mentioned, there are some key updates that are incorporated in the budget since workshop. We have, the governor did release his May revise, and it's also been through a number of committees. Incorporated in the May revise is a backfill to the county of up to $4.4 million for property tax loss as a result of the Thomas Fire and debris flow. There's also provision in the May revise to waive the county's local share up to $3.2 million of the debris flow removal cost. In addition, we continue to work with the legislators to seek a backfill of $2.6 million in TOT tax loss. This is not currently in the budget that will be voted on, although we are hopeful that there may be a last-minute revision to allow this. But the first two bullet points there are built into the May revise. With respect to final budget adjustments incorporated in tab A2 or Schedule A2, is this 4.4. We're recommending that money be treated as one-time money and to go into the strategic reserve. You know, this partially will offset the $6.25 million that we pulled out of the strategic reserve in response to the Thomas Fire and debris flow. In addition, we've made a correction within the Sheriff's Department since workshops to revise downward the revenue anticipated to receive from the city contracts, and have taken a corresponding reduction. Your board has taken action with respect to cannabis regulation program and enforcement. And so incorporated in the recommended budget are positions for permitting and licensing, as well as enforcement of $1.7 million. The 1.6 associated costs associated with the permitting and licensing is offset by permit fees and licensing fees, so that positions are self-supporting. The 1.7 to pay for the cost of staff associated with enforcement is assumed to be received from the recently passed cannabis tax revenue. The recommended budget continues your board's commitments on prior priorities and policies. It includes funding for the Northern Branch Jail, the fire tax shift, $4.4 million in deferred maintenance and the 18% formula. It includes funding for successor bargaining unit agreements, and it does not take money from or add money to the strategic reserve. This is consistent with your board's direction in December when we brought the policies to your. As we look at the operating revenues by fund, you'll see here how that breaks down. The largest piece, of course, is the general fund. The general fund makes up 39% of the county budget, or $425 million. As we explode that piece out to the right, you can see how that breaks down between your board's discretionary and as well as other revenues. Your discretionary revenue, if you do the math quickly, that discretionary revenues only makes up about 23% of your total budget. So as we look at meeting your board's priorities and the discretionary services we provide, it has to come from this relatively small piece. As we look at discretionary revenues, here are the basic sources. The vast majority of our discretionary revenue, about 84%, comes from property taxes. As you can see there on the right, that what we adopted for the current fiscal year and fiscal year 17-18 was $211 million in property taxes in that category, and that's growing to 216.7. Below there in the next categories, 5 categories, are the other sources of discretionary revenue that your board has to allocate to your priorities. You can see the rate of growth in our total discretionary revenue year over year is about 3.9%. Turning to operating expenses by fund, you'll see here again, general fund makes up, sorry, not general services, sorry, Jeanette. General fund makes up 35% of the county budget, $384 million. As we look at staffing here has grown by 84 positions The bulk of those positions are related to the Northern Branch Jail planned opening at the end of this coming fiscal year. But that's moving from 4,083 FTE in fiscal year 17-18 to 4,167 in the upcoming fiscal year. Focusing on retirement, you can see our retirement is growing by about $7.4 million, which is about 5.6%. This is caused by a combination of two factors. One is the increased FTE that we have built into next year's budget, as well as the escalation in retirement contribution cost, although not as high as we had initially anticipated, due to factors within the retirement system, not the least of which is the return on investment changes. As we look at maintenance, a couple things important to highlight here. This is our kind of total maintenance for the Public Works, General Services, and Community Services. I would note that the first line is our baseline funding. That's what we have historically provided. The second line is the 18% by formula. This adds up to roughly $4.4 million across the three departments. Public Works receiving 50%, General Services 35%, and Community Services the remaining 15%. Also incorporated in the recommended budget are some one-time funding for both General Services and Community Services for a total of about $1,450,000. Below that in the next section are other special revenue funds that are received by transportation, Measure A, the Highway Users Tax, HUDA, and the SB1 funding. I would note, just to clarify, that the special revenue funds below are not all directed at addressing the deferred maintenance. Some of it, especially the large part of Measure A, as well as all the HUDA monies, are there for corrective maintenance performed by county crews, essentially, and does not necessarily go and address the backlog and deferred maintenance within the road system. Our next slide, I'm sorry for the small print, to try to fit it all on one slide, are the key general fund discretionary fund balances. And I'll go through those quickly. Public safety property, so Proposition 172 revenues. You'll see there that the projected ending fund balance in June 30, 2019 is anticipated to be $49,004. These are earmarked funds that can only be used for specific purposes as outlined in the proposition. In behavioral wellness, we're expecting to end the current fiscal year with $686,000 in that fund. We're recommending the addition of $2 million with the ending fund balance of $2,686,000. These funds are available for the department should they need them to address IMD beds as well as out-of-county beds if that's needed within their department, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The cannabis revenue you see there, we've only built in the $1.7 million from the cannabis tax that was recently passed, and we show that as used for enforcement. The 18% deferred maintenance money, you can see we're allocating the full $4,367,000 to the three departments as noted earlier. Within capital, we have a fund balance left over in the current fiscal year of $700,000. We're anticipating adding 1.4, but also using 1.4, that will leave a balance of $700,000. This would be the initial money available for debt service if your board approved the issuance of a COP in the current fiscal year. Within roads, that's the annual allocation to roads. Strategic reserve, no changes to that. We're anticipating that to be $23,600,000. Litigation is growing by $2.5 million in the current fiscal year, recommended to grow by $2.5 million for a total of $4,700,000. This is there to provide cushion and is there to address litigation that we know is out there, and we've done this in consultation with County Council. Disaster recovery, the recommended budget as we outlined during the workshop includes $6.25 million for the upcoming fiscal year to address the local share of our disaster cost, as well as to provide cash flow for the needs for other county funds should they need that. program stabilization is there, as your board has adopted several years ago, and really provides a cushion for fluctuations in retirement contribution. We were fortunate in the upcoming year in that the retirement system had a rate of return on their investments higher than they assumed, so that we were able to benefit from that. But just as likely in a down investment environment, we could find ourselves short, and so this is our first line of defense to address fluctuations in retirement contributions. Facilities maintenance baseline that allocates all of that money, as I outlined in the slide prior, to the 3 departments. It leaves roughly $500,000 should something occur in the middle of the fiscal year that would require that use. Assessment appeals, your board has set aside in the current fiscal year money into assessment appeals fund. This was to address a backlog or a surge in assessment appeals experienced by the assessor, county council, and clerk of the board's office. That was 18-month funding that your board set aside, and so we anticipate ending the current year with $579,000 in there. We're expecting another draw in the upcoming year of $458,000, leaving an anticipated balance of $121,000. New jail operations is being funded according to your plan. Emerging issues, there's $10,000 of one-time money that's available. We'll talk about that at the close. And in contingencies is, we're recommending the addition of $2 million to contingencies. This brings us to a level that's not inconsistent with the prior fiscal years, but also provides a backdrop for potential contingency draws related to large capital projects. Finally, at the end, we have an unallocated fund balance of $376,000. So that's the summary of our discretionary fund balances. Be happy to answer any questions on those, or I can proceed.
Just one procedural question on that that makes me tempts me to micromanage which pot of the reserves things are in. So if a department needs an expenditure mid-year, out of any of these reserves, is it 4/5 vote, or is it only if it's a reserve where it has not been budgeted for the particular purpose that the department is asking it for?
Chair Williams, really good question. So where you see the recommended decreases, those are built into the budget already. So there would not be a 4/5 vote required for that. If your board wanted to take additional funds out of there, for instance, if you wanted to take funds that are currently reflected in the far right column, that would require a 4/5 vote mid-year.
So in some ways, if we viewed it as almost a 99% chance that there would need to be an expenditure there, that it would probably be perhaps more efficient to assign it to recommended decreases at some level. Okay. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to do that, but I just am thinking about that. Okay. Supervisor Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, Mr. Frappel, I do have a number of comments about this chart, and I guess to the chair, do we want to go through all of the departments first before making comments on this?
I think so. I think before we do that, but we do have a request to speak on the overview.
Okay, so I'll wait then? Is that what you prefer?
If you're, keep on going.
I can continue here and we'll catch it at the end. Okay. As we look at service level reductions, there are a number of service level reductions that were initially believed to be needed during workshops. Your board was presented those, and we've gone through those and addressed all those that were requested by departments to be funded, have been funded in the recommended budget with the exception of behavioral wellness, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. The reductions remaining about $4.4 million or 6.2 FTE. You'll recall that we So this is the remaining ones that are outstanding. This first sheet are the departments, the general fund departments. General fund, $1.8 million, 4.2 FTE. None of these service level reductions have been requested for restoration by departments. If you look into the next slide, we'll look at the non-general fund departments, and you can see here under behavioral wellness, there are two potential service level reductions, one related to the reduction of long-term IMD beds, and one related to the out-of-county short-term psych beds. The notes there, I think, are important in that to address the first one, under footnote 1, we have improving acute admin day client mix within the PUF. The recommended budget is built on a very conservative mix. What we've experienced so far this year, and what, especially within third quarter and moving into fourth, is a more positive client mix, and so there potentially will be additional revenues or resources within the existing in the department that can be reallocated if they're not needed to cover a lag in acute admin mix, so that they can address the IMD beds, long-term IMD beds. That will close a portion of the 1.5 that we've identified here as a potential service level reduction. In addition, we are setting aside, as I mentioned earlier, $2 million in fund balance, which will be available for behavioral wellness should they need that through the year. The second service level reduction for B-Well is related to the out-of-county short-term psych inpatient beds. And the department has been successful, is continuing to work hard to find more cost-effective contracts for out-of-county providers that we anticipate will be able to close that $780,000 gap. So we think we'll be able to maintain the average beds available per day of 7. The child support service reduction has not been requested for restoration. So the recommended adjustments and restoration expansions to departments are covered in a variety of schedules that are included in the recommended budget. So I will briefly talk about those, but there's much more explanation and detail in the printed recommended budget. So prior to workshops was our first category. We talked about these at length during workshops, totaling 18 FTE. Ongoing GFC of 1.7 million, one-time GFC of about 7.6 million. Post-workshops, in taking into consideration what we heard during workshops, we have worked with the departments to restore funding for a variety of sources, and I won't go through these at length, but you can see here, and they're all outlined in pages B8 and B9 in the printed recommended budget. But you can see here the CEO's office total of essentially $584,000, $2.5 million for sheriff for a variety of reasons, purposes. District attorney, roughly $388,000. Public defender, $164,000. Probation is there noted for additional probation officer. Public Works is the allocation of the 18% money, as well as some money to start setting aside a fund for the Vintage Ranch Bridge project when that's needed. That'll be a multi-year funding for that project. Within community services, there's about $1,180,000 of adjustments that are being recommended as part of the recommended budget. In general services, roughly $1.3 million. County Council, $493,000, as well as the Renew 22 initiatives, $815,000 that were we discussed during workshops. Also, just wrapping up in the non-general fund departments, we did include in the recommended budget a conversion of within fire of some seasonal employees to full-time employees. There's no general fund cost to that. It's all covered within the fire district's budget. As well as we have converted some three positions within public health from extra help to permanent. Again, these are offsetting costs within departments, no additional general fund contribution to either one of these departments. As relates to cannabis, this captures and accumulates the actions that your board took You can see here there are, in the permitting section, there's roughly $478,000 of positions, 3 positions there. Within licensing, there's about $1,129,000 in positions as broken down. And within enforcement, approximately $1.7 million. The positions, actual positions for each one of these departments is highlighted in page B10 of the recommended budget. Gives you a complete breakdown of the classifications by department. So the number of adjustments that have been deferred to hearing.
There's a question on that, Mr. Frappo.
Yes.
Supervisor Wolf?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to be clear on this cannabis issue. So there is an expectation that the tax will bring in $6.3 million, and 1.7 of that is being accounted for the enforcement piece. And then you're also anticipating 1.6 million will come in from fees. So if you take the 1.6 and the 1.7, that's how you get the 3.3 million essentially.
Supervisor Wolf, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
So there are a number of adjustments that have been deferred to hearing, and so we'll talk briefly about those as well. Within the District Attorney's Office, there's a request to essentially convert what's currently being done with extra help staff into a permanent FTE for a subpoena server, specifically, I believe, in North County. Probation Department had asked for 2 additional probation officers to address workload associated with Prop 63 and increasing supervision workload. The recommended budget only includes funding for 1. Within the sheriff, there's a number of items here highlighted that have been not currently recommended in the recommended budget, but would be there for your board's consideration should you so please. In Public Works, there are a number of requests here to maintain the current pavement condition index. The department's requesting roughly $8 million. The next 2 items under Public Works is really for the local share associated with the 2017 winter storm events, as well as the Thomas Fire and 1-9 debris flow. We believe that the funds that we've asked your board to set aside, the $6.25 million, will be sufficient to address the local match of the approved worksheets from FEMA Cal OES for these 2 disasters. You'll recall the board in your current adopted budget has already allocated $1 million from strategic reserve to offset the 2017 winter storm local share. And finally, on this page, Community Services has a pending request of $75,000 for the energy and sustainability initiatives. And for non-general fund departments, there we go. Non-general fund departments, as I mentioned earlier, there's a request outstanding for roughly $2 million for behavioral wellness, although I think we have addressed that through both the funds within 990 and within the 990 fund balance, as well as improved performance of the acute admin day mix within the PUF. So finally, potential adjustments to your recommended budget. This captures we captured this in a memo we sent out to your board, which is also posted on the web. We have identified in our discussion on the discretionary general fund balances, there's roughly $376,200 that's yet to be allocated. There's also $10,000 in one-time monies from rolling over from prior fiscal years that's available for your board's allocation, as well as potentially $4.6 million of cannabis tax revenues that should be received by the county in the upcoming fiscal year. Should your board decide to appropriate any of the 4.6, there are a number of potential uses that far outstrip available revenues, but they're there for your board's consideration and to frame a discussion at the conclusion of our hearings.
A question, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Lavin.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Frapwell, in the strategic reserve, you came up with 5.6. What is that? How did you come up with that number? Does that take us to the board policy original?
Thank you, Mr. Lavigno. So yes, the 5.6, you recall the current balance, as I discussed, is roughly $23.5 million. So if we are successful and the state passes their budget, we anticipate, and our recommendation is to take the $4.4 million from the state backfill, add that to the reserve. So that brings that balance up. And then to bring the balance in the strategic reserve all the way to your board's policy, which is 8% of your general fund expense, roughly 1 month worth of operating revenues, it needs to be about $33 million. So this 5.6 will take it, will close the gap to the full policy, board policy.
Thank you.
Supervisor Hartman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you talk about the hydrology study, Mr. Frapwell, if that has to come out of general fund, or are there any other sources of funding for that?
Supervisor Hartman, the chair. The $500,000 that we've identified that for a hydrology study is the high end of the range that may be done. The source of those funds, although here we've identified potentially the general fund, potentially could come out of the flood district. It's not clear yet. We'll have to do a lot more work with respect to what number that really is, but it is eligible to be funded from flood if your board so decides.
In addition, I believe that if the state pays the local match, there'd be about $175,000 that frees up to flood control, so that could be used to get it started too.
With that, Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to go into functional group summaries or whatever your pleasure is.
We'll take public comment on the overview first and questions on the overview. Supervisor Wolf?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. On this page 26, there are a lot of, the hydrology study is one, the cloud-based internet is another. There's a few things in here that we haven't really vetted too much. And then on the other hand, there's a few things that we have. So the one there, I mean, and this is only $10,000. It's a small, tiny amount for the homeless tracking. We do have one homeless issue that we have incorporated into the budget. Obviously, this is not the same thing, and it would seem like this should have just, given the amount, could just be included into the budget. And how is it different than what we already have?
Supervisor Wolf, the chair. The request here for $10,000 is essentially to do some reprogramming of the software that we use to do the tracking, specifically to enhance the information that we collect so that we can have additional data specifically related to the point of origin of our homeless. So this is really about tracking and trying to do a more robust understanding of where our homeless are coming from. So the $10,000 is simply a reprogramming.
And this is requested from HCD?
Yes.
Okay. And then just finally, on the cloud-based internet, until I read your memo about this, I didn't know there was discussion, but certainly it seems really important and something for us to pursue, like a lot of these other things that are listed here. And so I guess just my general question about some of these is that I think it requires more examination and review because they're very generic, and so I would just be concerned with some of these that are listed. And frankly, during our budget workshop, there might have been things that I might have mentioned, but I didn't. So it looks like whatever was mentioned during budget hearings looks like it's just kind of, there's a placeholder in here for that, except the cloud-based internet. I did not hear anything about that before, except from your description, which really does seem to be an important initiative for us to take.
Supervisor Wolf, the chair, thank you for that, and we do apologize for the rather lateness of this issue that's been identified. It came about because we are in the process now of going to do an after-action report for the Thomas Fire and the debris flow. As part of that discussion, one of the things that we identified as being able to do better is that you recall that we did a great deal of additional mapping as part of the debris flow disaster. Mapping as well as evacuations and notification. And so this became a really important tool as we communicated out to our communities with respect to potential impact. What happened there, the unintended consequences of that, is there were some delays on part of the public of being able to get the information because so many people were trying to get the information. And so as a result of the after-action report, this really came to kind of the forefront and highlighted as one of those things that we really could, if we made the right investment, we could do an even better job communicating with our public. So we apologize for the lateness of this item. It wasn't something that we'd identified at the time of workshop. Otherwise, we would have brought it up then. But it is something that's really, we thought, important for your board to know it's out there. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot more work that's going to be needed to flesh that out. But in working with General Services and ICT, this is our best estimate at the moment of what that might entail and cost.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Frapwell, in talking to some of the criminal justice partners, one of the issues there was also cloud-based internet use for discovery. Is there any connection between the two? I mean, is there any foundation that would be set here that could be adapted for other purposes?
Supervisor Hartman, the chair. I'd have to defer to General Service on that specific question, although I will tell you that as we move forward with the master planning or the strategic planning for ICT, one of the things we're going to be looking at is how do we position the county in a better way to be able to deal with the high amount of data, the amount of data that we're pushing around in all of our services, including the court services and between the criminal justice departments, is growing exponentially. And so being able to do that in a better fashion, more coordinated fashion, and cost effectively, cloud-based solution was likely a solution to that. The key on cloud-based for the criminal justice partners is the insurance of security. There are measures to do that. We would not be the first county to address this in a cloud solution. And so, but a lot of work is going to have to take place in order to make sure that we understand all the issues of each of the stakeholders and be able to adequately address those.
I also was a little bit surprised by it, but I think that the need in the last emergencies has been underscored if people go to the website to figure out if they're supposed to evacuate and they can't do that. That is something that we should reckon with. Public comment?
Mr. Caldwell?
Chair Williams, members of the board, Andy Caldwell representing CoLab. I specifically remember every year for the last 5 years and including back in April that your board asked for the gap chart. I couldn't find it. And I don't know why. Last year's budget, there was a lot of focus on a multi-year structural budget gap. I understand they closed that in some way, shape, or form this year, but I don't see the data over multiple years on the structural budget gap. I want to turn your attention to the back of the book. Just like in high school math, the answers were in the back of the book. And the point here is what you guys will spend doing for the next day or 2 days is talking about how you're spending your money. But you never talk about where the money comes from. Nor do you ever analyze the issues affecting where the money comes from. 80% of your discretionary revenues comes from property taxes. We lost 2 of the top 10 property taxpayers in the form of Veneco and Exxon. But I've never seen a scramble from the county to get that money back, although I have seen you dealing with issues of the loss of Montecito property taxes. So this is page G7. There's something really scary here. if you look at the bottom right-hand chart, even though this is great news that we went from 12.4% unemployment to 4.6% unemployment, the bad news is our poverty rates are increasing. So you have nearly 100% full employment in the private sector, and poverty is getting worse. What does that mean? Well, turn to the next page for more specifics. First of all, I have always hated the bifurcation between North, Mid, and South. There is no such thing as Mid. It's North County and South County. And they split off the Mid to buffer the consequences of the numbers. The bottom line here is you look at Santa Maria, Lompoc, and Guadalupe. 17%, almost 17%, 16% below the poverty line. Look at the numbers of the people, bottom right-hand one, the number of people getting public assistance by region. You add Mid-County, because there is no such thing as Mid-County, to the North County, 41,000, nearly double what you have in the South. So what is the difference between the South County economy and the North County economy? North County economy is blue collar. Your policies favor STEM, high tech. You have policies that are against resource-intensive and energy-intensive industries. I used to work in one of those. Our gas bill at Sinton and Brown, which was just a subsection of Union Sugar, was $100,000 a month back in the 80s. And the point here is you've helped create a permanent urban underclass by the policies you've created. Years ago, we used to have this statistic that was included in the annual budget that showed the number of Hispanic males in the Santa Maria and Lompoc valleys engaged in STEM. It was 6%. Yet you say as a policy we want high-tech jobs. That shoe doesn't fit the North County's foot. It doesn't fit. And, you know, the bottom line here, poverty is climbing, unemployment is dropping. And you're not analyzing that. You're not analyzing where your money's coming from and why more money isn't coming that way. That's a fatal flaw of county government and this budget process.
Let's go into the functional group, Health and Human Services.
Stand by. Technology is a wonderful thing when it works. There we go. So, Supervisor Williams, Chair Williams, and board members, so we'll go through the functional groups now. On our first slide here, we'll break down the functional groups that we'll be going through over the next several slides. And you can see here that the top three, the largest three sections of the pie here, make up $918 million, or 83.2% of the total county budget. So our first group is our Health and Human Services group. You can see the 5 departments there on the right-hand side comprise of social services, behavioral wellness, public health, child support services, and down at the bottom, first 5. They have a total operating expense of $401.5 million and represent 1,734 FTEs. At this point, we'd be happy to discuss any of those departments should your board desire.
So, I'm sorry. So if we don't identify a department, they're not even coming up right now? This is the budget?
This is. If you'd like them to come up, they're all poised for your board's questions.
So we could essentially get through the budget in 4 slides with our different, I mean,
5 or 6.
5 or 6.
And this is sort of meant for, mainly for public discourse and even more for supervisors' discourse about what changes we need to make. There aren't a huge number of differences that staff are presenting over what they presented in April.
Yeah, I get that, but, you know, and my take was kind of, so I mean, we had 3 days originally scheduled, then 2, and now maybe 1, but, and I get the desire to shorten, but I think, you know, because we have had the time that, and it's, I guess, no giant surprise that when I was going through the budget, I kind of had a lot of the same concerns that Mr. Caldwell's expressed, that while things are going well financially and economically in our county, you know, things aren't, at least in my district, getting better. We've got more people on assistance, and so you know, I don't know if this is a Renew 22 question. What are we going to do different? And I don't know if that's inside the budget that we discuss these items, or when we do talk about that. But, you know, I think most times when things are are tough economically, we just think, well, if we get more money, things will improve. You know, our budgets continue to increase for some of these health and human service departments, and I don't think, you know, when I look around my district, I've got homeless people suffering from dual diagnosis all over the streets. Like I said, I think 2/3 of our kids are on some sort of social assistance. What are we going to do different? And I don't know if just glossing over, and maybe it's, you know, these are the financial numbers, and that's why we're kind of just running through it. But we should at least schedule some time. Maybe it's not in the budget. And I know that's kind of what Renew 22 is all about, is we have to do something different. But doing this, I just think that there's got to be a bigger view of the entire way we do things.
I absolutely agree, though I'm not sure that a longer slide presentation addresses what you really want to get to. So I do think it's an appropriate conversation. There are a number of questions about the budget that do relate to economic development. I mean, to me, the questions that Mr. Caldwell brings up, and of course that quote from a past planning director of our county haunts me and convicts me. You know, I think that there are things that we can do to address that, and we've talked a lot about this with long-term planning, and later on when we get to deliberations, I would argue that a lot of our projects with long-term planning have to do with opportunities that we could engage in to not limit opportunity in our county for people to make better wages. Supervisor Hartman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to put this in context, how I think about it. Renew 2022 is our effort to reduce our expenses and to reorganize in a more effective and efficient way, because government over time tends to accrete, and you tend to get things that need to be looked at in terms of your current goals. I think the second step after that is to look at what assets we have within county control that we can generate more revenue from. And I'm particularly interested in renewable energy and recreation and parks. Then we really do need to look at economic development throughout the county. We did put $85,000 last year in the budget to start that process, like other counties have done. It's not a county-only responsibility. It is the county that can help convene that process. But we were confronted with the disasters that we experienced in Montecito, and that really took all hands on deck for that. But I think we can get there, but it's not something the counties can do on their own. I did an analysis once, or a brief look. The average median income a couple years ago in North County was about $66,000. In South County, it was $86,000, and in the Santa Ynez Valley, it was $118,000. So I would argue that we have many different economies throughout Santa Barbara, and it really is the cities that are responsible for generating the economic revenue. They have the opportunity to, that's where urban development is supposed to go, much of it. So we can't have this conversation with the county in isolation, but the county can play a role, as other counties have done, Sonoma, Ventura, SLO, in pulling together interests for economic development. I believe CEO Miyasato has already begun thinking about that and how her staff can bring it forward. So I don't really think that this is quite the place to do it, but I think it certainly frames how we're all thinking about where we're headed over the next couple of years.
Supervisor Wolf?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the discussion and Supervisor Hartman's reflection on the issue. I do think that we should go through each department and at least have the, there's not that many slides for each department head to go through. I know for me, I have a couple of questions specifically for 3 departments, but at least, again, there's only a couple slides for each department head. So let's have them come up, let's have them go through the slides, and we can probably move through this very quickly.
Why don't you ask the department heads that you wish to have questions to ask a question, and ask that question, and they can come up and provide the answer.
So you
We're
don't
not
want
going to ad hoc change the whole format of the meeting, and we can do something different next year. But just ask your question, and ask the department. They're ready to come up and present information that you need an answer for.
Okay.
But
I'll do that, but I will say that this is, we have done this in the past, asking our department heads to come forward, and it's not just for us, it's also for the public, but I'll go ahead and do what you are requesting. So my first question is to the sheriff.
Can you wait for the sheriff to the second public?
I'm sorry?
Functional group. So our agenda today breaks out the departments in several functional groups. So right now would be the time to ask a question or highlight a slide for behavioral wellness, child support services, First Five, public health, or social services. And then after that, we are moving on to public safety.
Then I have a question for public health.
Supervisors, just as Dr. DeRenos is coming up, we do apologize if there's been confusion. This is the same format we had last year, although in prior years we've had different formats, but we followed the same as we did last year.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Reynoso. I have a question where it was in here about the volunteer program, develop and implement. Well, maybe we should go through look at the slides then. Can we get the slide for public health? And it would be page 3. And if you could just explain the development and implement a new approach to volunteer program and what you have in mind for that, and what volunteer program, because I know there is one for animal services, and I'm not, if that's what you're referring to. So if you could clarify that.
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, thank you for bringing up that question. So we have noticed that throughout our department there are various volunteer programs that are operating within the programs like animal services, within the labs, so not very coordinated. So our intention is really to have a coordinated official volunteer program. In particular, we are also noticing that we have great resources in our community, and so we want to partner up with the academic institutions, the high schools, as well as the community colleges and UCSB to really provide educational and training opportunities, and looking forward to building a pipeline, if you will, towards future workforce from our local communities. So it's a coordinated effort tapping into what's here already.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Another issue that has come up for public health that I'm aware of is the increase of STDs in our community, and I'm wondering what public health is doing as far from an educational standpoint and outreach.
Yes, so we are not noted in these slides, but we are undergoing a reorganization of our community health programs. So leveraging different staff expertise, pulling them under one coordinated health education, health promotion program, and partnering up with other community partners to leverage resources to address STDs. So we've been in communication with a variety of partners, UCSB, Planned Parenthood, and our own internal staff to come up with a coordinated effort to address STDs in particular.
And when do we expect to see something coming out?
So with part of the role of the newly, if approved, the new senior epidemiologist, so I anticipate in July.
Okay, good. And then finally, my last question is, and I think this really deals with cannabis in general, but we have in your department, we have cannabis licensing and cannabis enforcement. But what we haven't addressed, and I'm going to touch on this later, is the education component, correct, which, as we talked about through all of our cannabis hearings, was how important that issue is. So what are your plans for that?
So our health education promotion expert is under the enforcement category, and so I anticipate pulling together my colleagues in behavioral wellness and other community partners to, again, form a coordinated effort so that we can approach county and communities in a consistent manner, utilizing the state resources as well as what's already here in our community.
Okay, and I guess that would now be a question for Dr. Gleghorn, or maybe you can answer. We don't have, as I recall, allocation for behavioral wellness for cannabis education. Is that maybe Dr. Gleghorn, if you could come? Thank you, Van Reynoso.
Thank you.
Good morning, Supervisor Wolf, through the chair. That's correct. There is no allocation for behavioral wellness education at this point. The requests were coming through enforcement, and we didn't really have a role in the enforcement piece.
Okay, thank you. And if I could, that's all for this functional group, but I will say that the allocation of the tax funds that we expect to get being used for all of these other possible programs is concerning to me, because I don't think we really know the impact that we're going to see from cannabis. And so I'll address that in my discretionary fund balance slide. And then finally, before we leave this, I just, this is, as Supervisor Lavagnino started off talking about poverty and children, I think this functional group is probably one of the most important one that we have. Behavioral wellness, child support services, first five, public health, and social services. And where we were last year when we had the huge cuts to social services, I'm extremely pleased that we reinstated some positions. I think that the work that social services is doing is exemplary, and it's one of those things, being a supervisor, that you just dread that there is no child that somehow slips through the cracks. And I just want to, give a shout out to the folks in social services who are really looking out for our kids, our elderly. We talk about a lot of things, but yes, they may be getting food stamps or they may be getting other assistance, but there's a lot of issues that we need to also assist with. That is our job. And also, public health is an enormous contributor, and I really appreciate the work that goes on from public health and, of course, behavioral wellness. Alice, you've brought us a lot more opportunities for step-down placement, and I look forward to, more and additional beds for our community. That continues to be a big issue and one that I hope we can tackle very soon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm going to call on Mr. Lavanino, but after that, I will have a question for Mr. Nielsen that Supervisor Wolf fortunately gave me a good softball for, of leaving no child behind. Supervisor Lavanino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to point out, I know we've kind of had the discussion before between trying to balance this sector and maintenance and those types of things. I think sometimes I just want to highlight that this is the largest expenditure. There are the most employees in this sector. I think we spend 20% more on health and human services than we even do on public safety. So the cuts that happened last year, just to recall that they were from the state legislature. Those were cuts that were made above our head. And I don't think I need to point out who controls the state legislature, but it wasn't a priority of theirs at that point. So my biggest concern with this sector is that we do spend 400.
Your partisan wipes are so seldom. I was really not. I really didn't see that roundhouse coming.
Well, it was, it was your guys' friends that made all the cuts to social services. I mean, that was indisputed fact. But the thing that scares me about this sector is kind of what I was alluding to before, is that we spend $400 million a year. And I think if we spent $500 million a year, we'd be in the same boat that we are right now. And I think when we spent $300 million a year, we had the same problems. So I'm really looking for Renew 22 to spark some innovation. I appreciate the CEO's push on this to look for new, more efficient ways to do things, because dumping another 40 or 50 or $60 million into this sector, I don't think the return on investment is there. I just think we need to figure out a different way to do things. So that's kind of my push.
And as Mr. Nielsen comes up, I'll make an editorial comment in strong support of what you say. I mean, I do think there is something wrong with how we do things in this county. But I'm not talking about county government, I mean society. And county government can be a part of the solution for it, which is, and unfortunately it is something totally reflective of what's happening in the rest of the country, which is that there are more people employed, but they are employed in fewer hours and they are employed at lower wages. And a sort of deepening of that cycle. Part of that is a shift to service sector work. Part of that is the death of manufacturing. Part of that is that I would argue, are overly dependent upon two sectors in our economy here. I am a big supporter of ag, but we're overly dependent upon it. We're overly dependent upon tourism, even though I appreciate the role that plays here. And of course, we're also facing challenges in retail. And so it's part of our job, I think we should engage in this, but it's also part of the public's job to engage in it, since every time they buy something on Amazon instead of from a local business, we vote with our dollar, not just at election time. And what kind of economy we want here is very much a result of hundreds of thousands of us voting with our dollar in one form or another. And so I do think that the budget is a good time to touch on many of the issues, but I do think that there should be some time and carve out that we do as this board to look at larger economic planning, or at least economic discussion of what kind of things that we try to engage in to help foster good jobs, or in some cases, what are we willing to do to get out of the way of good jobs being fostered. My question for Mr. Nielsen is, one, I've been trying to engage a lot with resource parents and people in the foster care system, and there is a lot of positive stuff out there, but a lot of resource parents seem to feel like there's not enough support out there. And do you feel that if there were funds available that, particularly, I understand one of the contractors that did provide resource support is no longer around, is there a role for a position, either in-house or contracted out, to provide more resource parent support that we don't have at this time?
Chair Williams, the answer to that is a definite yes. We use the resources we do have to the best possible ability and are constantly looking at contracts and the work provided by contractors, as well as our own staff, in meeting the needs of all parts of our system, including resource families. But with the continuum of care reform push to get children out of group homes and congregate care and back into the community, there's definitely a need for as much support as possible for those children and those families, whether it's their own biological family, relatives, or whether it's a resource family that doesn't initially know the child. Those are very critical situations where a child's been used to being in a congregate environment with all of that attention and those resources. And as much as we can support families with additional social worker attention in terms of time and quality time with those parents and with those children, the better outcomes we will have.
And I've heard that there may be some other funds to address that. Ballpark me your shot of getting that with non-general funds, and what's your percentage? Is it a 60% chance that you would need general funds for this, or a 70% chance, or?
Well, at the current time, I mean, a large part of our revenues related to that area of our work are related to realignment funds, 2011 and 1991 realignments, and so, you know, the anticipated revenues for those for the coming year are higher than were originally projected in the earlier stages of our budget. A social worker costs approximately $120,000 a year fully loaded, and so you know, it will remain to be seen in the coming fiscal year if we get additional revenues above and beyond what we've budgeted. If so, in that area, that's the sort of resource we'd be spending it on.
Thank you. Mr. Adam?
You know, I hadn't intended to weigh in on this stuff, but you know, you might look at the history of the degradation of the industrial and manufacturing economy in Santa Barbara County. Because over the past 40 years, it is undeniable that the government regulation and interference has increased. These parts of our economy have suffered. And along with them, their former employees and stockholders and our tax base along with it. And I think, you know, going forward, we really have to consider how much government intervention has done for us. You know, the more intervention we've had, the worse the results have become. So maybe we ought to back up from that a little bit instead of decrying the fact that we don't have enough money to do all the stuff we want to do, because maybe if we do more, it will even get worse as it has for the last 40 years. Just saying.
I agree partially. There has been good results too. I mean, we have cleaner air, but I wrestle with the idea that if we had, 20% more than we had right now of impacts to our air quality, but we had 80% of the manufacturing that we once had on top, or 180% of the 80% of the manufacturing what we once had, whether that would be a better balance than what we have now. And I also wrestle with the fact of by driving manufacturing out of places, how much pollution have we created elsewhere in places that are far less regulated. So I wrestle with both of those questions, but I don't think it's helpful to just deny that there have been no benefits. There have been benefits, but the question is not are we worse off, but the question is there a better balance to strike? And I do think that there's a better balance to strike. That's where I am in agreement with you. Other questions on this functional group? Then we will move after a short bathroom break. Public comment on the Health and Human Services functional group.
Chair Williams, members of the board, we have 2 requests on this functional group. We're going to start in Santa Maria with Charles Huffines and then come back to Santa Barbara for Mr. Caldwell. Charles.
I don't think we're here in Santa Maria. I don't think we're here in Charles. Go ahead and...
Try now.
There we got you, Charles. We're resetting your time clock. Please proceed.
Chairman Williams, members of the board, and Dr. Cleghorn, who's sitting in the audience. I'm here to ask, before the entire budget is put forward on behavioral wellness, that I again ask for the clients of the RLC Resource Learning Community in Santa Maria through TEMA and Lompoc that you give us additional funding, out of, if possible, the innovations project that you had with the peers and the communications project, or the money that's left over from the original WET program that went in a number of years ago. We need this money desperately because of the closing of the Telecare's drop-in center. The clients that are part of Santa Maria's ACT program have either been transferred due to the closing of the drop-in center to either the Foster Road Clinic, or have been moved down to the RLC in Santa Maria, or the supportive services. We do not have enough funding coming out of SLO County that we operate under, that we can continue to keep, we're getting at least half of the population from Telecare via either the ranch or Telecare themselves. And we are about ready to, coming next budget, either we're going to have to close down a day or more. We're going to have to drop some staff because of it. And these people need the services. They need the drop-in center to aid in their recovery and wellness. This funding could be very easy. We have not received a raise in a contract in the last 8 to 10 years since we had the real budget crunch when Dr. Dietrich was on board as director. This is a necessity. It needs to be done. It will help everybody in the North County. In some way, we need to get the funding. I mean, this is the last chance that anybody can come to you and ask, but this is a necessity. It is not otherwise, like I say, there will be people turned out on the streets in North County. Some of the, shall we say, highest risk clients coming from McMillan Ranch, coming from some of the people at Telecare, they will have no place to go, no place to hang your heads. I thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Caldwell.
Chair Williams, members of the board, if you could turn to almost the very last page in your budget, page H17. They're going to put this up on the screen. This page, if I did my math right, which is always a problem, represents $27 million. It's called lost time. I'm glad they finally put this in. I had to complain a long time, but they used to have this in the budget book all the time. $27 million. One of the top questions is, why are the primarily paper pushers in Health and Human Services, why do they have the highest lost time rate? That right there is a $27 million hole that represents 200 employees a day that aren't at work. 200 employees a day all year long. On page D217, and you went over this in April, and this is a chilling statistic. I'm still flabbergasted. Unfortunately, it's listed under accomplishments, which it's not an accomplishment, it's a disaster, that the Department of Social Services serves over 145,000 county residents, or 32% of the entire county population, 65,000 children, or 65% of all children are clients of social services. That's not an accomplishment, it's a disaster. And then if you turn to page D194, this is an example. You're not going over this. Look at number 2, percentage of adults that successfully complete substance use disorder, 39%. That means 61% don't finish. How is that a performance measure? Now, I'm not blaming them per se, because you've got to have willing clients, and you have to have a law that has consequences for not following. Look at the youth. You want to talk about the future of Santa Barbara County, look at number 4. Percentage of youth that successfully complete substance use disorder. It's even worse. It's 62% don't finish. 62%. That gets to a point on page D188. On D188, behavioral wellness, department description. The Department of Behavioral Wellness promotes the prevention of and recovery from addiction and mental illness. How are you measuring your success? I loved what Carly Fiorina said one time. Activity is not an accomplishment. You're spending $400 million a year on what we would call the dysfunctional, the needy, and the broken in our society. Year after year after year after year, and the statistics are getting worse. We begged to plead with you, throwing more money at the problem ain't going to work. It ain't going to help. It's not going to work. It doesn't work. You've already proven it doesn't work. Page 188, oh, I'm sorry. There's another department that, actually, that's in the next section. Anyway, I'm finished on this, but the bottom line here is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you're not measuring it, we believe there's a reason for it. How are they doing on prevention and recovery? Where are the numbers? Where's the proof that you're accomplishing anything? We've got a huge problem here. And again, the poverty, you need upward mobility for permanent urban underclass. That's blue-collar manufacturing and industry jobs. There is no other solution. There is none. I spent 40 years basically dealing with this subject in my life. And what about the $27 million hole in your budget? Why is that never a topic of conversation here? Thank you.
That concludes public comment.
We've talked a lot about the government's share of responsibility for cycles of poverty and maybe a little bit of consumers for economic growth, but I also want to highlight that there is a share in the employer section of the economy as well. American workers are far more productive than they were in the 1970s, but they have a much lower share of wages than the 1970s. Previous to the 1970s, as productivity rose in this country, wages rose in this country. And since the 1970s, collectively, our policies and employers have not shared with workers the same percentage of economic growth, and that is also coming home to roost. For the first time in the last 10 years, for the first time since the Great Depression, American worker productivity is not rising as fast. There's a certain point where you get paid, 10, 11 bucks, 12 bucks an hour, 13 bucks now coming around the corner, and you just don't work as hard as you do if you have a commensurate share of the economy. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around. It's a useful discussion to have. We can be a part of the solution, but we won't be the only ones involved. Mr. Labanino?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I wanted to kind of piggyback on that a little bit. I didn't want my comments to be construed as somehow blaming the Social Services Department. I think they're doing an outstanding job. As Daniel said in the April workshops, basically they get people when they're in crisis, and we don't put enough money into prevention and those types of things so that we don't see 2/3 of our kids at their front door. So I just wanted to make sure that that is not construed as that way. I think the folks that are doing the work are kicking butt. It's the fact that, beyond their control of who they're dealing with and how many people they're dealing with. So I wanted that confusion cleared up a little bit.
Supervisor Adam.
Well, I just want to make sure that people understand, if there's anybody watching at home, that my silence doesn't mean I'm agreeing with what you're saying. And
I don't think anyone ever makes that assumption.
Well, I'm just going to say it out loud so that if somebody watches this and they say, why isn't he saying something else? And because we're not really supposed to be having a policy debate here, we're passing a budget. And, we've kind of drifted off into, well, no, I realize it is. And I would like to get off on a lot of different policy questions. And I know that you and I could team up on some policy regarding revenue. But, we're passing a budget here today. And a lot of our instructions from, different discussions over the past year are built into this budget. And, we make policy decisions that over the whole year that are assumptions loaded into this budget and will be in next year's budget because of what we've told our CEO and her staff. And, I think that largely, the ship has sailed. And it is what it is. And, we're all going to vote on it maybe later today. And it will be what it will be. And, during the year to come, we'll be working on next year's budget. And so, I just look at it like it's kind of a foregone conclusion. It is what it is, and let's get on with it instead of trying to go back and have the policy debates we've already had. And, maybe we can remember that these policy debates, as we have them, you have a ramification in the budget in the future, because I think we tend to look at these things as individual events, but they really get combined in the budget to a great extent. So with that, maybe we could think about things on a larger scale in the future.
I will endeavor to do so. We'll move to the public safety group. Since nobody up here wants to take a break, I will. Oh, I thought I just asked you. Sorry. Okay. Well, all right. 5-minute break. We're reconvening. We're reconvening, folks. We're reconvening. And we will begin with our public safety functional group. So any supervisors who have something to highlight or ask about, please prepare your questions. And those that are considering public comment, if you have not turned in your speaker slip, please do so. Supervisor Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a few questions for the sheriff. Good morning, Sheriff.
Good morning.
In my BIF from the budget workshop, I had asked about the CFMG contract that was supposed to come back, and the response that I got was that it would be presented to the board by the end of this fiscal year. And I looked at our next couple meetings, and I don't see it on the agenda. And so it was supposed to be back to us, I think, in April. So I'm concerned about that. So when will it come back to us?
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, my understanding is that that will be presented to the board on July the 3rd, first meeting in July.
Okay. And then, thank you, Sheriff. The other question I have has to do with not just the accreditation that we're trying to achieve in the jail, but also what costs we're anticipating for the North County Jail. And I think just in general, I am very concerned about the cost of opening the North County Jail. I was there to visit either last Friday or the Friday before, I can't recall. And, you know, the date is soon upon us. And so what, I think you had noted that you were going to be talking to CFMG about costs for that, for mental health services. I think we're going to be looking at costs for food, laundry. There's all these costs that are out there. And when will this board have an opportunity to hear from you about what the overall cost will be, not just for staffing, but for running the jail? And then the second part of the question is, as I always bring up, when will we have the plan for the reduction of bed space at the main jail?
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, a couple of things. One is when we did the Northern Branch Jail operational plan. There was factored into that plan an estimated cost of operation, and there were escalators that were built into those projections. So what's changed, particularly in the medical, is the level of medical service and mental health service that we contract with, in this case CFMG for, which was greater than what was estimated at the time, because as you're aware, we ended up increasing our medical contract and did a fairly substantial addition to that. So the discussions with CFMG will revolve around the delta between those costs and what was previously estimated. And I can't give you a hard number at this time. Obviously, we will be entering into discussions with them very shortly, and we'll bring them to you as soon as possible. With respect to the question that you have, I'm sorry, the last,
about the main jail.
The main jail. A lot of that hinges on what's going on in terms of the survey with Vanner, with discussions in terms of what the needs are, and we will be coming back, working with General Services, but we'll be coming back to the board with a plan on that in the near future.
Okay. Thank you, Sheriff.
Thank you.
I just want to ask CEO Miyasato a question, because as we have a line item in the fund for emerging issues, and I will say that one of our largest emerging issues that we are going to have as a board is making sure that we are adequately funding the North County Jail. And I am personally really worried about that. I know that we've been putting and socking money away, but we've also been using it for hiring and so forth, which is what we should be doing. But there are, I really am not starting to feel, but it's becoming very, very apparent to me that this is going to be a huge hit on our budget. And so I think that is probably one of the biggest, if not the only, emerging issue that we have to be ready for next year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I'll piggyback on Supervisor Wolf's questions, because number one, I appreciate your vigilance about that, because I do think they're the department and its issues, and so I should give you a congratulations for last week, I think. Because I think the issues surrounding the department, I think, deserve a lot of attention from this board and obviously from you. I think staffing in particular, if we do not improve things, that we become in this sort of fiscal and morale death spiral where things keep on getting worse because we don't fix that. So what I don't expect you to have everything ready for the solutions for the universe today, but what I would love is to plan on you and Mr. Malakian coming and telling us progress report midway through this budget on staffing versus OT, on the population of the main jail, the braceleting program, civilianization, and the North County Jail, because I think there are some solutions that we're trying to help you address in this budget, but we want to know that they're working for you and for the department and for everyone in the department. So I guess my ask is that well before, as soon as you start getting some good data, I hope that you would come to us, especially well before there are any changes in your upper echelons of staff, to come back to us with how things are going on those 4 issues. The Supervisor Wolf mentioned the North County Jail, and I would just add to that the braceleting, the staffing versus OT, and the civilianization effort.
Well, Chair Williams, I certainly appreciate your comments, and certainly would be happy to come back to the board at some point mid-year to give you a progress report on a formal basis. We'll be doing that on a more informal basis as we go along. I do want to take the opportunity to thank the board and the CEO's office in particular for teeing up the budget that, although challenging for all concerned, and I certainly wouldn't want to be in your shoes having to make these difficult decisions with the amount of revenue that you have versus the amount of expenditures that are asked for and arguably required. But I do think that that the budget plan that we have been able to work out through the CEO's office and that's presented to you today, and that hopefully will receive your approval today, is one that does give us an opportunity to address some of the challenging issues that we've had, particularly with our staffing. Obviously, it's going to be contingent upon our ability to hire and retain the staff that we need, but I think we do have the tools now and the mechanism to be able to do that. We have a plan in place that I think is a solid plan, and I think will bear fruit. There is some certainty, as you said, in terms of the election that happened last week, and certainly we know that we're going to be working together on this problem in the foreseeable future, and I'm very optimistic that we're going to be able to address some of these difficult challenges in a way that's very meaningful and that will allow the Sheriff's Office to continue to provide the high-quality service that we have been providing despite all of the challenges that we've been faced with.
Thank you. Other questions, either for this department or another in the functional public safety group?
Two questions, Mr.
It's
Chair.
good that we have a functional public safety group as opposed to a dysfunctional public safety group.
First one's to Mr. Frappwell. So I'm just curious in what I heard up here. Are we still on schedule for the funding plan that we've had in place for the North County Jail?
Supervisor Lafayette, through the chair, yes. So the funding plan, and we took the opportunity this year to look at it to just kind of validate that the costs that we have assumed in the original modeling of the plan that we're still on track for. We believe we are. There's a great deal of work that continues with the Sheriff's Department and General Services, looking at going through line by line each operating cost the department's likely to incur with the opening of the Northern Branch Jail, validating kind of the assumption on that cost, and also looking at the procurement methodology needed in order to put that in place so that that timing meshes up with the opening of the facility. So there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes. You can rest assured in that regard. And we do believe that the funding plan is still a solid funding plan.
Okay, great. My other question was for District Attorney Dudley, and it was about the request. One of the things that hadn't been resolved is the subpoena server, and just curious if that's something that we've ever looked at of contracting out, or why is that a county employee, I guess? Yeah.
Supervisor Lavanino, through the chair. Well, let me rewind that question a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
If it's predictable, it's preventable, is a motto we often use in law enforcement. And as of Friday, both of our subpoena servers resigned. And that was very predictable because it was an extra help job. They weren't employees of Santa Barbara County. And in this economy, people can't survive on extra help money. And in terms of, you were asking about us getting someone else to do that job, what were you thinking?
Yeah, aren't there civil subpoena servers that, I thought there were,
No, I think there are. I think there are civil.
So what do we do when our extra help folks just walk out the door and say, I'm not doing this anymore?
Well, luckily they have enough allegiance to us and to the county, so they gave us 30 days notice, and we quickly call up all of our other colleagues throughout the county and say, hey, do you have anybody in mind? Merely recruiting for an extra help doesn't work. So you have to find a friend of a friend, and we've been able to do that so far. But as I told you, it's a very dangerous job. It's a labor-intensive job. It's a job where it really helps if you speak Spanish. And those kind of folks are hard to find, and certainly hard to find without any kind of benefits, which this kind of job is. I can't imagine a situation where it would cost us less and we'd have as much control as we need. by taking that job out of the district attorney's office. Sometimes a lawyer will be right in the middle of a trial, and they'll need to get somebody right away. If we have to jump through the kind of hoops I think we'd have to jump with based upon my experience with civil service, we wouldn't get the services we need. It really needs to be an employee, needs to be a full-time employee of the district attorney's office.
Okay.
Thank you.
Supervisor Hartman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to commend the justice partners, the courts, the DA, the public defender, probation, sheriff, for all the work you've been doing, coordinating your activities and saving the county money, and also doing a better job for the people who otherwise might be incarcerated. I just want to urge everyone to continue on this track. We've identified some additional issues. I think there's been a lot of progress on the incompetent to stand trial, and that's really helped our budget. But there are additional issues, and I know there is an interest in continuing to look at how there can be more efficient calendaring, particularly with misdemeanors, our continuance policy, and discovery, how we can get maybe a cloud-based discovery and be able to use that more efficiently. Pretrial release or incarceration, video arraignment, these are the things on my list that I just want to ensure that we continue and perhaps mid-year get a report back to us on the progress that's being made. Let me just ask, CEO Miyasato, this will be coordinated largely out of your office, is that correct?
Supervisor Hartman, through the chair, yes, we can coordinate those activities since they will involve many of our justice partners.
And so you won't have an ad hoc committee of the board or anything like that involved?
We can request that, and maybe we can, in the first meetings of the new year, we can discuss that and see if that's necessary. I think it's really your board's choice of how you'd like to handle that.
Supervisor Wolf. Then we'll go to public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Heitman, I have a question. In one of the BIFs, and this actually came from a meeting that we had at Juvenile Justice Coordinating Council, which had to do with the fact that your department would be responsible for education for those who might be, as it relates to the cannabis. And the response I got was that it was going to cost approximately $50,000 a year. Now, and that would come out of your department, that you would absorb that from your department?
Chair Williams, Supervisor Wolf, we were hoping that there would be an opportunity to use some of the marijuana taxation or cannabis taxation funds to cover that. We've had some preliminary discussions with the CEO about that. Okay. It is, as you mentioned, a relatively small amount of money, but it is directly coming out of that legislation and the change in how youth will be handled when they receive a citation.
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate you bringing this up at our committee meeting. And, I think just from, just a better understanding of now that of what is involved as far as implementing any type of resources for your department as it relates to cannabis is important for us to know, particularly as it relates to the use of the tax funds. And I think we heard from Dr. Gleghorn as well, the potential use of those funds for some of these important issues. The other thing I wanted to ask you was about the sex offender DPO position. I think there was funding. You had asked for 2 positions, you received 1, and I think the suggestion was a combination, using that position to also assist with the sex offender program. Can you comment on that? Because I guess I'm very concerned about what you had said at our last budget workshop about the need for a full-time DPO for sex offenders because of the increase and other matters. So if you could touch on that again.
Supervisor, through the chair, it's my understanding that they recommended funding through the CEO's budget was specifically for the Prop 63 position. That's how we identified it. That's the information that we had received.
Oh, so not even as a combination? Okay,
that wasn't anything that we had
okay.
been told. It would be a very difficult position to provide in that type of combination. The sex offender position is still on the slides as a requested expansion. As I had previously indicated, the number of sex offenders under supervisions increased by about 16% since 2014, and the statute requires that we use what's called a containment model, which is a collaborative approach to supervision of these offenders. It includes a supervision officer, a treatment provider, and a polygraph examiner working as a team to ensure that sex offenders are not engaging in behavior that could put the community at risk. The model requires that staff be able to react very quickly to the information being obtained in treatment through the polygraph exams, as well as through field supervision and forensic review of the offender's electronics. Additionally, these offenders are often subject to GPS monitoring, which, while it's a useful supervision tool, it adds an additional layer of complexity to their supervision, and it's somewhat labor intensive for the staff that oversee those offenders. So we did maintain that request as an expansion to balance these aspects successfully, so that the supervision of these offenders would be a priority. We would like to see the ratio of offenders to an officer to be reduced to 40-1. Currently, it's about 53-1.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Williams and supervisors, so thank you, Supervisor Wolf, for pointing out that BIF. So we have, just to point out to the BIF, I was also at the JJCC meeting, and I did speak to the CFO for probation at the time on this request for this mandated programs, because it was brought up. And I apologize, Chief Heitman, but I thought at the time he had said that this would be a minimal amount, so a couple $100 a month at most, just because people aren't being adjudicated for cannabis. And that was a difficulty, and that it could be absorbed by the department. So I still appreciate the department putting forth a request for up to $50,000 a year if that's still needed. We would have considered that if we'd gotten the same information we're getting today.
Let's go to public comment.
That's why these hearings are important.
Chair Williams, members of the board, we have 5 requests to speak on this group. We're going to start in Santa Maria with Joe Armendariz, come back to Santa Barbara for John Atena. Hey, John. John, push the button there and get your mic going. Thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Am I on? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now, but I think Steve said he liked it better the first time.
No doubt, no doubt. Anyways, as I was saying, I think Andy hacked my computer, stole my speech. I love what he had to say this morning as an opening salvo. And look, I have to say this has probably been one of the most interesting budget hearings that I've been involved in 20 plus years, because for the first time, frankly, and for the first time, we've actually had a discussion about economic development and economic vitality, which are the issues that are near and dear to my heart. I'm sure they're near and dear to many of you as well. Look, when I turned 50, I realized a couple of things. My metabolism slowed down, I get fat, and I have to walk neighborhoods, and take long walks after dinner. And it was doing that recently that I was noticing all the homes in my neighborhood. I live up in Foxenwood, and I often like to wonder, what does a person do to afford a home like that? And it seems to me rather obvious that you don't afford homes like that on wages. You afford homes like that because perhaps maybe you're a doctor, or you're a lawyer, or maybe you're a bank CEO, or you own your own business. And so it occurred to me in that context that what we really want, it seems to me, what we really want as a vision for Santa Barbara County is to create an opportunity society, or I'd edit it to say an ownership society. How do we help more people get upward mobility, as Andy suggested, so that they can afford to own a piece of the rock, as the Prudential Insurance Company used to describe it? If our fellow brothers and sisters in Santa Maria Valley and the North County don't own a piece of the rock, they are not going to have respect for other people's property. And it would occur to me and seem clear to me that we will never have enough money to address the issues that we've been discussing over the last half hour with respect to social services, behavioral health services, public safety, if we can't improve our economy. If we can't get our economy growing, if we can't democratize our economic system so that the lower end of the economic ladder have upward mobility, we're always going to be on the short side of the ledger sheet, as it were. And so it really does seem to me very, very obvious that we have to look at our comparable advantages, particularly in the North County, and what those comparable advantages are is our resource-based sectors, i.e. oil and gas. Look, I'll let Andy Caldwell defend agriculture. That's his sector. I'm here to unequivocally and unapologetically advocate for oil and gas production in the North County. Look, final point, and I think it's consistent with what I've said already, which is the way to empower people, particularly the low-income families of the North County, is to invest strategically in education. Oil and gas projects generate substantial property tax revenues. Most of that goes to our schools. It doesn't go to the county, it goes to our K-12 public schools, and it seems to me that's how you give these kids an opportunity to really have the kind of future that many of us, frankly, take for granted. And so I would encourage you as you go forward to not be this sort of a green eye shade certified public accountant body, but instead be visionaries in terms of what we want Santa Barbara County to be all about. And I believe that what that means is creating more jobs, creating more opportunity for those in the North County, particularly for those in the North County, because they obviously and clearly need it the most. Thank you.
John Tana, to be followed by Ethan Bertrand.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. My name is John Tana. I am the Vice President of the Santa Barbara Deputy Sheriff's Association. Our association represents about 430 deputy sheriffs, custody deputies, dispatchers, and district attorneys, investigators. The grand jury recently published a report which talked about the chronic understaffing and the excessive amounts of overtime of custody deputies working in the jail for the last 10 years. Custody deputies in the jail have had to work mandatory overtime, where we signed up for shifts ahead of time, and then prior to this, we had standby, which meant we had to sit at home and wait for the phone to ring and then come to work. Working all this overtime has taken a toll on the lives and the members of the department's families. We have also faced similar situations in our dispatch center with chronic understaffing and excessive amounts of overtime. The dispatchers currently have 16 hours of overtime that's built into their schedules. In reading the grand jury report, the DSA supports the recommendations that they have requested. The DSA strongly supports the recommendation that the Sheriff's Office consult with a professional recruiting firm, review current recruiting practices, and provide recommendations, including incentive programs. This is a copy of the monthly PORAC magazine. PORAC stands for Peace Officers Research Association of California, and they represent almost all of law enforcement officers throughout California. In this magazine, there's a section in the back that lists advertising from law enforcement agencies throughout California. The need to attract and retain qualified candidates is tremendous, and most of these agencies are using financial incentives to attract new employees. Sampling of the advertising in the back would include the BART Police Department is offering $10,000 for lateral officers. Chula Vista Police Department is offering $10,000 incentive-based experience for officers. The Modesto Police Department is offering $15,000 incentives for laterals. The La Habra Police Department is offering $10,000 hiring bonuses for laterals. I applaud the sheriff and the undersheriff for trying to solve this problem with the recruitment teams in both the custody and the law enforcement area. This is a good step in the right direction, but more is needed to attract and retain qualified candidates to join and stay with the sheriff's office. The residents of Santa Barbara County need a well-funded, properly equipped, and highly trained employee. In order to have this, you need to properly fund the sheriff's budget, and you cannot cut the budget. Thank you.
Ethan Bertrand, to be followed by Spencer Brandt.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Chair and honorable supervisors. My name is Ethan Bertrand, and I'm the board president of the Isla Vista Community Services District. Public safety continues to be the most pressing issue in Isla Vista. From alcohol and other drug mishaps to property crimes to sexual assault and quality of life issues, it's very important that we have the adequate funding for our first responders to be able to work with the community. We support the recommendations from the CEO's office for restoring funding for a 1.7 FTE for the Isla Vista Foot Patrol, as well as restoring funding for a sheriff's special duty deputy for Isla Vista. Two positions in particular that we're very concerned about and that we're pleased with the service we've received from them thus far are the community resource deputy as well as the detective in the Isla Vista Foot Patrol. The community resource deputy has done an important job and an effective job of working with youth and families, working with long-term homeowners on property and noise issues, working with rental property owners and management companies on how we control neighborhood issues, as well as coordinating with student groups. It's really important community-based policing that we hope to continue to see. The detective has also been very important with making sure that crimes that have taken place are followed up upon in a reasonable time, and that victims in Isla Vista receive the services that they need. I'm happy to announce this morning, as many of you know, that Measure R passed in Isla Vista, giving us over $700,000 new funding for annual services in Ivy, on top of our $200,000 annual contribution from UCSB and other private grants that we've been able to receive. We will continue to be a partner in issues in Isla Vista, especially public safety, but one thing that I'll remind the county is that per state law, the Isla Vista Community Services District is allowed to contract with the County of Santa Barbara or the Regents of the University of California, or both, for additional police protection services to, quote, supplement the level of police protection services already provided by the county and the UC. So we count on the county to provide the level of service that has been provided in the past so that we can work to fill in the gaps where necessary and improve the public safety in Isla Vista. So we thank the CEO for the recommendations, and we hope to see this restoration. Thank you so much.
Supervisor Hartman.
Well, I just wanted to congratulate you. I believe it was 85% of the vote to approve the tax, almost unheard of.
Yes, we're hopefully going to reach there by the certification. But.
And I just, from my perspective, in the 3rd District, having the CSD there as a partner has made all the difference in safety with UCIV, the CSOs, the rape crisis. You really are filling in gaps to make it a fuller response to maintain public safety. And you're also doing a great deal in terms of public works. So we're going to be moving forward on town-gown relations between the university and the CSD and the county, and I'm so glad now that you're a full financially fledged partner.
Yes, well, thank you so much. We look forward to our work together.
Spencer Brandt, and then Mr. Caldwell.
Good morning, Chair Williams and supervisors. I really just want to echo some of the things that my colleague Ethan said before me, especially when it comes to the detective position at the Isla Vista Foot Patrol. This is so important to our community. I myself have been a victim of burglaries. Burglaries in Isla Vista are very prevalent. I think that one of the reasons maybe why is because we have such a friendly atmosphere. We are a college town. Everyone's always over at each other's houses. We have a very high rate of burglaries, and this has been sort of rising over the past year or so. When it comes to following up on those things, when it comes to making sure that people feel comfortable going and reporting those things, and like there's going to be some follow-up and a reason for them to report, it's so important to have this detective position. And the same can be really said for when it comes to victims of sexual violence in our community, whether they're female, male, or any gender. We really owe it to victims to make sure that we grant them that follow-up and that they feel like there's a process that they can go through where there is going to be some justice served. Like I said, with sexual violence and burglaries, both these crimes are very underreported, and I think that having the detective, is going to slowly help turn that around. So thank you very much. Have a good one.
Mr. Caldwell.
Chair Williams, members of the board. During that last segment, you guys talked a little bit about, is this the time to discuss policy? I believe this is one of the only times, at least historically, the board has discussed policy. And why? One of the things that you skip over each and every year is every segment of this doesn't just have performance measures, it has objectives and priorities. Therein, you should weigh in. You're supposed to be representing the public, as do I. And you're supposed to be weighing in on how they're doing and whether you think their objectives are going to meet the goals and the needs of the public. So this is a time for policy debate. It's one of the only times it's really scheduled for policy debate. With regard to the sheriff's issue, we completely acknowledge there's a morale problem with the overtime. We do believe that you can't turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to the fact that other jurisdictions are out competing you. You're in a hole because of the cost of housing here. You're also in a literal fiscal hole and a different kind of hole in terms of maintenance. That jail, the old jail, the South County jail, should have been done away with 30 years ago. And that is one of the problems with retention and recruitment, is nobody wants to work there. And that's on you, not the sheriff, because you set that budget. We need a long-term funding plan for the South County jail. We disagree you're spending too much on the North County jail. You're spending too little too late. And you should be spending more and be starting with the South County jail. I think one of the most honest statements in this entire budget book is on page D102. It's the public defender. They didn't put performance measures in. They didn't rehash last year's because they said the number of cases we are appointed does not measure performance and quality. That is a true admission, and most departments should be admitting the same. Activity is not an accomplishment, and what they're measuring in terms of performance doesn't necessarily tell you how good of a job they're doing and what they're actually accomplishing. Fire. What are we going to do? We're already in fire season. What are we doing to break the cycle of fires and floods? What are we going to do different? As I've mentioned numerous times, in the 1960s, the board considered suing not Southern California Edison or PG&E, but the federal government for fuel loading. I've not heard the board talk about that. In terms of most of the land that burns is federal land and or state responsibility areas. Why aren't we going to the state and the feds? Why isn't that more of a performance measure? It's mentioned in the fire department, but it's not quantifiable. That cycle, of course, resulted in deaths this year, whole-scale destruction, and we're not out of the woods, as you well know, for the next 3 to 5 years. This should be top of the list. How do we break the cycle? And again, this is not rocket science, because we used to have less fires in this region in the days of primitive society, because in primitive society they used to light that thing up every so often and prevent the buildup of fuel. The fact that there was 100 years of fuel is unconscionable. Do you blame the light that came off the wire, or the federal government that stored 100 years worth of fuel that didn't burn? It exploded. It exploded. 60,000 acres a day consumed in twice. 120,000 acres in 2 days. Again, What are the objectives, priorities, and accomplishments in terms of what the real mission, values, and priorities and needs are of this county? If you don't do it now, when will you do it? Thank you.
That concludes public comment.
We've got Supervisor Lavanino, and I'm going to also just give we're going to have Supervisor Lavanino, Supervisor Wolf, and then I'm going to also have a follow-up for the sheriff, just to give you warning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to, and this is a question I had of the fire chief before when we met privately, and I just would encourage him to bring this at some point. One of the questions was asked about what we've been doing with the fire transfer tax, the shift. And first off, I also want to, publicly acknowledge the CEO's office and Jeff of making sure that we continue two things in public safety, and that was stay on track on the North County Jail funding and also continue the fire transfer tax. And really, when you think about it, I mean, we've moved through this budget. That's $20 million of the general fund this year. Almost $21 million, I guess. A significant investment in what I think people are most interested in. But the question I had asked of the fire chief was, on the money that you've received, can we go back to and take a look at the City Gate report and kind of give me a checkbox of what's been done and what hasn't been done? So I'm just encouraging the fire chief to bring that at some point because it is very impressive. I think that's what people are expecting of us, is similar to what happened with Measure A. We gave them a list and said, if you increase your tax, here's what we're going to do with it. And you can go through each item now and you can check the box. Yes, we did the Union Valley Parkway. Yes, we did the Santa Maria widening. We did the bridge. Check, check, check. And I think when you look at what we've done with that transfer tax, you can check a lot of the boxes off on the City Gate report. So just kudos to the fire department there.
Supervisor Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we go back to slide 14? And I guess I want to talk about the new jail operations. And I think one of the important words that we heard from the sheriff was Delta. So as much as we, I think, would like to believe or think that we're funding the North County Jail adequately, again, I'm very concerned that we're going to be seeing additional funds that are going to need to be allocated. My question is that this year we put in almost $11 million. And then there's a recommended decrease of $12.5 million with a balance of $11 million. So I think within the last few years, and CEO Miyasato can correct me if I'm wrong, that within the last few years we've been taking the money out and it hasn't been building up the balance. So here we have $12.5 million that we're taking out of this fund for operations. And my assumption was that it was going toward the training or the hiring of new deputies, custody deputies. Is that where that $12.5 million is going?
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, those are great questions. And yes, so on B21 of actually your budget, we have the future jail operating funding plan that we've referred to. And it shows that we make contributions every year per our plan, and there are planned draws, operating costs that are paid for every year. And you're right that in the next couple of years, we've seen an acceleration of costs coming out of that fund as was planned to staff up. So you're right that a lot of those costs, majority for 18-19, are for to get ready for the staffing for the Northern Branch Jail. There's also a small construction amount that's also included, but it's on B21 of your budget.
Right. So yeah, we have been taking out small amounts that just began in 15-16, even though the plan started in 11-12 where we weren't taking out anything. And now we do see this large amount. So I'm going to ask the sheriff if this is for custody hires, where are we on that for the $12.5 million?
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, as CEO Miyasato indicated, this is part of the planned drawdown of this operational account that was developed. The whole idea was that there would be an incremental sweep of a percentage of general fund growth that would be put into the fund, and the fund would build up until about the halfway point, which is about where we're at now, and that then as we got on the tail end of the plan that we would draw down amounts from the piggy bank, if you will, of collected funds, and those matched up with the amounts that have been partitioned out of the budget would ultimately pay for the hiring of the new deputies. And as you're aware, we have already hired some tranches of new deputies, and we're about to hire some more new deputies as well. We had the initial drawdown that was done for a relatively small number of people, which essentially was the transition team that was put together. So it is working according to plan. This is exactly how it was anticipated that we would be doing this.
My question, though, is specifically how many custody deputies have you hired, and does this $12.5 million go for those hires, or is it being utilized for anything else?
Yeah, I'm going to flip that question to my staff here just a moment so they can give you an exact answer on that.
Supervisor Wolf, through the chair, yes, that money is for the hiring of, we have currently 30, I believe, custody deputies that have been, not including the 5 in the transition team, that have been hired, and then we have approximately a little over 60 that will be hired in the next fiscal year.
Okay, so that's
including all staff. There's 15, 28 that will be additional custody deputies specifically.
Okay, so what you're saying is with what you've hired now and what you anticipate, that will use the $12.5 million?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Why don't you just stay up there, because I've got one more for you. So I'm wrestling with similar questions, though, on the patrol side, or how it relates to the patrol side. So in total, you guys have 60-something new positions next year, minus the decreases in some areas of your organization is a net increase of 52.73 positions. So most of that's in custody, some of that is in patrol, some of that is in civilians to help with the other stuff, including so I guess my question is, this is an ambitious program. It's partially planned for, partially augmented by our budgetary decisions that sort of we wrestled with back in April, and the CEO put in the recommended budget out of our desire to decrease OT and thereby hopefully increase retention of our employees. Do you feel, give us a sense at the big picture, is this going to get the job done? You know, I'm not asking is it enough, because there's never enough, but is this going to get the job done?
Chair Williams, I do believe that this plan that has been put together and the budget that has been proposed that will support that plan is the major step in the right direction. I don't think it's going to completely solve all of our problems, because we are understaffed, as you're aware. You know, a couple of surveys have shown that we're understaffed in the main jail as well. So even assuming that we get everybody hired for the new jail, the jail opens up and all that goes according to Hoyle, we still are going to have somewhat of a structural staffing deficit, because we don't really have enough people to really run the main jail. Now, that is going to be somewhat fluid because we're going to have the new jail operational. It's going to draw a lot of pressure off of our existing jail, and we've also seen about a 10 or 11% decrease in our overall jail numbers in the scope of the last year as a result of some of the pretrial changes that have occurred in the court system and whatnot. So this is a very fluid situation, obviously, and I don't want to stand before you and say, yeah, this is going to be the silver bullet that will solve all of our problems, but it is, we believe, a major step in the right direction, and we believe also that we proved through the Santa Maria experiment that if we do have sufficient staffing, we are going to knock down the overtime, and we are going to inherently increase morale because we will have less of an overtime drain and strain on our existing staff. So I hope that in a roundabout way answered your question.
I think it does. And then maybe from the big picture to how it might affect a particular area, we've discussed before the fact the law enforcement needs in Montecito have been higher after the disaster just because more burglary attempts, a certain amount of traffic control issues as construction and cleanup gets done. With these 10 civilian positions and with the patrol, what kind of continuance of that presence will take place after the FEMA funding runs out?
You know, the reality is that we have, I guess, titrated down our response from a very huge high in the immediate aftermath of the disaster to the point where we are now. We certainly would like to see some additional staffing. Obviously, that is dependent upon our staffing levels and our ability to provide service. We have taken that into account to some degree in this budget, and I foresee that in the foreseeable future that we'll continue to be providing some enhanced service in Montecito, but it is obviously a challenge for us in that we have only a limited amount of staff, and we have a lot of need throughout the county. I don't know if we want to
maybe asking specifically on the 10 civilian positions to have, you know, one position and one shift. Sorry, not one post, but one position or one shift or two. Or what does
positions are essentially a trade-off for the sworn positions that will decrease our costs and still allow us to provide service and leverage the sworn staff that we have, but completely interchangeable, obviously. So,
yeah, I just noted. I'm trying to be modest in my hopes, obviously the civilian position can take reports and can do traffic control, which are the two of the biggest needs out there. I'm not saying they can do everything as sworn can, and it would be better to have a sworn, but will you be able to put one out there, or, you know?
That is certainly our plan, and if you figure that roughly it takes 5 positions to staff an around-the-clock position, and those positions likely won't be around-the-clock positions. They would be more of a daytime hour type position that we would employ. So I think that we're going to be able to see some very good results with this. And do you want to add to that?
Supervisor Williams, to the chair, you touched on it, or you are the chair. Never mind, Chair Williams. The whole idea behind the SSTs is exactly what you touched on, which was that taking some of that burden off of patrol is not it is not a force multiplier for patrol or crime prevention.
The Wolf also has another question.
Thank you. I just want to talk about MOUs. Glad to see that you've reached an MOU for that. That was brought up. I also want to touch on the MOU for air support unit. So as was discussed very early today, you've eliminated a pilot position. Originally, the MOU, as I recall, had 2 pilots, 2 for department and 2 from fire. So I'm concerned about where we are with the air support unit just in general, and you or this because we want to make sure that because that's kind of a misnomer now. But so I want to ensure that that we have available stuff. So my question is, you have eliminated one pilot position, and do you have the other position filled?
Supervisor Wolf, the retirement of deputy, and the plan to reduce that sergeant position, that in this case was a pilot position, and then to replace it with a civilian helicopter pilot. That position is currently being the position is filled.
So how are you doing on that recruitment? I mean, it's open. Are you interviewing? Where are you on that?
Supervisor Wolf, quite honestly, waiting. We are one pilot back, extra help, a pilot that retired recently, waiting to see the process of recruitment. The recruitment will commence probably as soon as this budget hearing is finished.
But you do have budgeted for one pilot.
That is correct.
So it shouldn't be budget hearings.
In the sense that we didn't know.
Well, take that away from me.
Prudent wait and see.
Okay. Professional group, before taking lunch, here for services or policy executive, board of supervisors, or county executive office budgets. You can leave and get some work done. But if you're here for agricultural weights and measures, community services, planning and development, or public works, you are in the right place. I'm sure there's going to be a question for P&D or for public works, maybe even for community services, and I'll just ask the board to prepare their questions. And if there's none immediately, then we'll get ready to go to public comment, because I do know there's some public comment on this. Supervisor Hartman.
Thank you. My question is for community services, and I know the answer, but I'm not sure everyone else does, and that is I would like Mr. Chapshin to talk about the ESI team project leader position, and specifically how that can help generate revenues over time.
Supervisor Hartman, through the chair. This is a position we feel there are monies available from the cap and trade dollars, and they're spread out over a number of state agencies. And this position would actually go and seek and find opportunities for grant opportunities and revenue sources for the county. So we think it's kind of an investment in bringing more dollars in to help both with sustainability issues and also working with other departments as well.
Supervisor Wolf.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chapshin. Okay. And I'm sure this, you can stay up, because I'm sure this was just an oversight. On page 3, highlighted objectives, which wasn't included, was San Marcos, the park that is being worked on.
The foothill preserves.
I'm sorry?
San Marcos?
Yes. San Marcos Foothills Park that is being worked on with funds from CSA 3 and Parks. Yes. And I know our Parks Commission has looked at it. So I just wanted to highlight it as an objective, because it's taken a lot of work from your staff, and it's another opportunity for open space and parks amenities. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Go to public comment.
For this functional group, we have 3 requests to speak. We're going to start in Santa Maria with Lori Tamura. They come back to Santa Barbara for Pat Saley and Andy Caldwell. Lori Tamura, please, in Santa Maria.
Hello, this is Lori Tamura, a citizen of the Orchid area, and I put in a request to speak in regards to Union Valley Parkway. Had the opportunity to speak in the past. We just finished the Elks Rodeo facility, where throughout the 4-day period of time there was 35,000 attendees, and all of them going in and out at one access point. There were police, sheriffs, CHP, and a number of people controlling traffic through that access point. And it just proves again how important the extension of Union Valley Parkway is to the east side of 101. Ironically, earlier today you were talking about economic development and economic vitality. Can you imagine how many more times the Elks Rodeo facility could be used for events, for tax dollars, for activities, for tourism, if it had a better access point? Union Valley Parkway is that access point, and we're asking that you consider initiating this process for the benefit of northern Santa Barbara County and the county as a whole. The Elks are very important to this county, as well as the future high school that will be built on the east side of the freeway. This is something that you can all easily agree to and support this go around. This is the third time we've asked for it, and we're hoping that you'll move forward this year. Thank you very much, and I'm available for any questions.
Pat Saley. Then we'll hear from Andy Caldwell.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Pat Saley. I'm here to speak about library funding. For the record, I'm a former member of the Library Advisory Committee. I am currently president of the Friends of the Montecito Library. I'd like to make 2 points. The first is, as I'm sure you know, but I would like to remind you, 5 of the 15 libraries in the county are in the unincorporated area. That is Cuyama, Los Alamos, Montecito, Orcutt, and Vandenberg Village. And I'm sure you know also that these libraries are very important to their communities. 4 of them are in North County, 1 South County. And I think you also know that the funding for these 5 libraries is pretty much strictly from your board and from fundraising. And that is pretty tenuous. It is difficult to raise money for operations. It's much easier to raise money for a building with naming rights and such, not operations. And also, the assigned population for each of these 5 libraries is pretty small. So while raising per capita, especially on an ongoing basis, would be great, it doesn't bring a lot of money into these 5 smallish libraries. And they will still have pretty significant deficits. It varies. The second point is something your board talked about last week, and that was the idea of taking the Management Partners Library Study and moving forward. There is clearly a need to study the countywide library system, its organization, admin, and funding. And your board talked about forming an ad hoc committee with 2 board members, Mr. Williams, Ms. Hartman, the library directors, and there was some confusion on this, but I would certainly advocate for having at least 2 library advisory committee representatives on that committee. And I would think your goal would be to look into options and set up a system that has to be better than the status quo, so we don't have year after year of struggling to fund libraries. So in closing, I am asking that you make the libraries with deficits, several of which are in the unincorporated area, make those libraries whole so they can retain their hours and services and build up their collections. And then secondly, that you move forward with the Library Ad Hoc Committee to study alternative ways to organize and fund libraries in the county. Thank you.
Andy Caldwell.
Chair Williams, members of the board, Andy Caldwell representing CoLab. I'm glad that 4 of you have been to one CoLab annual dinner, and you saw the breadth and the depth of our membership. We represent literally every single sector of the economy in terms of our membership. And what I can tell you is we don't get complaints about the cost of fees as much as we get complaints about the uncertainty of your process. That somebody can go through a process, pay a fee, be dragged literally through hoops for 3 to 5 years, and then still come out with a denial or conditions that kill the project. There's no certainty. You have land use ordinances, but by the time they get interpreted and applied and mitigated, Santa Maria Energy, remember that one? PCEC, been doing business up there, that oil for over 100 years. Veneco's gone. Exxon's on life support. And some of these things are, you know, maybe it's the federal government dragging their feet on the pipeline, but what have you done to tell them to quit dragging their feet? And or what did you do to push through an emergency permit for trucking? Those are 2 of your top 10 taxpayers. Veneco and Exxon were, and 80% of your money comes from taxes. Do the math, connect the dots. With regard to public works, they're fudging a little bit by giving you an average on pavement index, but they told the truth on one page. Your rural roads are at 47. They're at 47. How close is that to abandonment? How close is that to requiring rebuilding at 5 times the cost of maintenance? Rural roads are at 47, not 50-something, and the goal is 70. You know, one of the things that killed, and again, these projects went through planning and development, EIRs, all the rest. One of the things that killed the oil industry, and one of the reasons it's looked down upon, is this quest for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And in your next section, you know, like a dog on a bone, the county keeps wanting to push community choice, even though you've done a couple of different studies and it comes up as non-feasible. Well, you have to ask yourself, how important is spending, for instance, a couple $100,000 a year on that versus on page D396, on page D396, under, actually I'm on the wrong section, but it still applies to this, is 400 emergency work orders in the county for broken water lines, HVAC failures, sewer backups, broken windows, and roof leaks. You know, Darrell Pinney in Santa Barbara gets slammed for being a slumlord. I wonder if the county is the biggest slumlord in the county. Does that title belong to the Board of Supervisors? That's more than 1 a day. And again, your money comes from property taxes. Your property taxes come from the private sector, and the #1 payer is oil and gas. Thank you.
Concludes public comment.
Supervisor Wolf.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chapshin, I have just a clarifying question. First of all, thanks, Pat, for speaking about libraries. I just wanted to clarify the committee discussion that we had, because I understood that you were going to come back to the board with recommendations on the makeup and the goals of the committee. It hasn't totally been finalized, even though we want to move in that direction. Am I clear on that?
Supervisor Will, through the chair, that was my understanding. We will be coming back.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Supervisor Lavanio, I want to make one possible correction. I don't treat this as gospel because it was about 6 months since I looked at the figures, but when I looked at the property tax figures, I actually saw a number of business entities that are creating a lot, just more property tax than oil and gas. maybe it's how they parse it, but it sure looked to me like if you looked at just the flower industry, if you took all the greenhouses and added it to the flowers, that was actually more property tax than oil and gas. But don't treat it as gospel. Maybe just look at the
What kind of flowers were they growing?
I think these were the old style flowers as opposed to your new style flowers.
Okay. Well, that brings me to my question, and that's, well, first off, I just want to say, I want to give, I've probably spent a number of my years up here questioning some things that happen in planning and development that I haven't always agreed with, but the staff in that department that took an idea through an EIR, through an ordinance, and through a ballot measure in 16 months, unbelievable. It was a lot of people really working hard and getting the job done, and I just wanted to appreciate that. But it does bring me to the next point, which is, question is are we going to do something about what I'm curious about in cannabis and the revenue that we're projecting and what we're talking about? So the tax passed, but does that mean, so tomorrow or today, or when does that go into effect when somebody walks into P&D and says, I want to start working on a permit, and we start handing them a bill, or what are we doing with that? And I guess the same thing for treasurer tax collector, when he gets done. Next, I guess.
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Lavanino. We opened for business for cannabis permits last Thursday. We haven't issued any yet. I don't think we've received any applications yet, but we have scheduled intake meetings.
Okay, very good. So I guess if somebody walks in with a check now.
We know what to do with it.
We do.
Yes.
We do?
We do.
Okay, awesome.
We do.
Perfect, thank you. And one other thing, though, not for you, but on the comment that Annie made, actually I think rural roads are at 42, not 47 is what I saw. But the other side of that too, though, is arterials are at 69, and we never talk about that. So, when you look at it as a whole, I think we want to bring all roads up. Obviously, I think that's the goal of everybody, but yes, rural roads are I don't want to use the, I won't say what I was going to try to say. Trying to take a street slang and maybe make it sound a little more intelligent, but a lot of people are driving on arterials and connectors, which actually have a higher PCI than our average. So yes, rural roads are dragging those numbers down, and it would be nice to get at some point a look at how we break that down. I was frustrated with that we use PCI as a barometer of how we're doing, but we don't, that's the only time we really talk about it, and we don't schedule repairs and those things based on PCI. So we're not working towards the number, which in my life was always, if you're judged at X, you should probably spend your money towards X if you want to manipulate that number. Because I think that could be done. If really what we wanted to do is make that number go up and everybody feel better, there are things that you could do to make that number go up. I think what's more important is to continue to use the strategic, science-based approach that Public Works is using of how to best spend the money, and that number will be what it is based on what our policy decision.
Supervisor Adam.
Well, I just wanted to give Mr. McAlpin an opportunity to come up, or maybe Mr. Snedden would rather handle this, to come up and tell us why we don't use PCI to determine maintenance.
To what?
Supervisor Adam, through the chair. PCI is one of the factors. We use a lot of different factors, including the Street Saver asset management database, superintendent's institutional knowledge and knowledge being out there in the field every day to maximize the use of these tools, you really need to, when we're working under a reduced funding regimen, it's all aimed at preserving our infrastructure to the best ability we can, given the funding that we have.
Two kinds of, there's worst, and then there's preserve the best, but which one do you do?
Correct. So yeah, the pavement preservation philosophy, that's why you see a blend of really bad roads and then the preventive treatments, the roads to hold at a higher PCI.
Yeah, and they're funded.
Either, but we take many roads as we can when we have very limited funding to do the rehab.
So you're I don't know, I didn't realize that we would be doing the pavement preservation model, and is that as a result of the degradation, you know, the state of our county roads? You're really stuck in that rather than first.
So the blended preservation philosophy is the most efficient way to maintain a whole network. The category we fall into when you have limited is you have to make selections between the two and the balance of the two, and starting to having to you can do, because that's the really expensive treatment, so you're tilting towards the preservation.
Right. Well, those places need rehab just continue to drain down through the and drag the whole system down accordingly.
Correct, and that's why, as Supervisor Levanino, I think, was kind of mentioning, is if you just aim for PCI, you can do things that will hold your PCI, but your backlog may continue to grow because it's averaging together the good roads with the ones that need the rehabs.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Supervisor Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, CEO Miyasato, the issue was raised from one of our speakers about work orders and our sewer system and so forth. One thing that I'm excited about that I'm seeing in the budget is the allocation for the debt service. As I recall, one of the major projects that was going to be done at the county campus, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that a lot of it had to do with the sewer system and the water system and some of the real antiquated systems that we had in the county campus that would take care of some of those issues. Am I accurate in that assessment?
Supervisor Wolf, to the chair, yes, you're correct. That was part of the list of projects for COP funding.
Okay, good. Thank you. And then, it was Ms. Black. I have a question for you. Thank you. Can you explain where we are with the short-term rental ordinance since it's been to the Coastal Commission? What would happen if we take no action? What recommendations do you have to make sure that we can tie up this kind of outstanding piece that's hanging out there?
Mr. Chair and Supervisor Wolf, so on May 10th, I think it was May 10th, the Coastal Commission denied certification of our LCP amendment to regulate short-term rentals and homestays. So they didn't suggest modifications, they just flat out denied it. So today, we're in the same position as we were yesterday, which is short-term rentals in the coastal zone are unregulated. So what I thought about was what options do we have moving forward? And I think we have three. Two of them take resources and one of them does not. The three would include, and there's probably way more than three, but just three to kind of talk through the issue. One would be to revise the ordinance to expand the historic overlay, allowing for short-term rentals. So we had the really small Miramar historic overlay. The Coastal Commission didn't say they would accept an expansion, but they certainly seem to be leaning that way, that a substantial expansion of the overlay may be the way to go. So that's one option. And we've done a very rough cut estimate of the cost associated with that, and it's about 0.75 FTE. The second would be to revise the ordinance to allow short-term rentals throughout the coastal zone with regulations. That would be a pretty simple process to go through. We've already developed the regulations. We'd have to reprocess the ordinance through both Planning Commissions, your board, and the Coastal Commission. But we kind of know what that would look like. But that would allow short-term rentals throughout the coastal zone in all of the zone districts. And we've estimated that that would be about 0.25 FTE. And then the other option is to take no further action. And the effect of that would be to allow short-term rentals throughout the coastal zone without any regulations. And the cost of that is zero.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And then just a quick follow-up. So our ordinance for inland is still in place?
Yes, Mr. Chair and Supervisor Wolf, our ordinance in the inland area is in place, and I believe it is operational in September, October?
Yes.
So it isn't in operation yet, but it's will be soon after the summer season.
Okay.
And just one other clarification. Your board already acted on the long-range planning work program back in April 3rd, I believe, and short-term rentals was not incorporated because we just didn't anticipate that the Coastal Commission would reject our submittal, so it's not included in our long-range planning work program.
Yeah, I saw it somewhere as a possible expansion.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that explanation.
Sure.
Supervisor Harmon.
And farm stay, when do we expect to have that ready?
Farm stay is going to be processed as part of the ag permit streamlining project, and so within the next year or so. Yeah.
And since you're up there, I'll, just in case you have a comment on this, I will talk about I think some of the discussion we've had today about economic development is really important, and I do think that there are some substantive moves that we could make in long-term planning and a little bit in community development to address it. All the issues surrounding the Goleta RFP have caused me for the past 2 years to be scouring for a solar developer that would be willing to do utility scale solar in county.
What's the Goleta RFP?
The Goleta RFP is the energy request for proposal that SCE has in, and essentially the danger has been that there would be a restart of a natural gas facility or a new natural gas facility if we cannot get together and develop renewable energy. And, you know, the lo and behold, when I went solar company to solar company, they're like, hey, I'm glad that you, their response was, hey, I'm glad you want us here, but it doesn't seem like the county does, right? You know, and this isn't pejorative of P&D, it's simply P&D knows that people sue, so they require environmental review, and we have, as a policy mechanism, concurred with that. But essentially, it's against the rules to do utility scale solar in anywhere in the county except for Cuyama, unless you're willing to do environmental review for pretty much not just your project, but other projects. And I think that's a big sign that kind of is, to me, exhibit A of what we've been talking about today. Obviously, some of our economic development questions, there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of consternation between people north and south, but I thought this is one of the things we all want, right? Is some job producing, you know, good paying job producing clean energy, and something in step with our values, and yet it's another example of something that we have essentially rules in place to prevent. And so I feel it's very important that community development can do some of the site selection work that we've talked about, and that P&D can, at least towards the end of this fiscal year, begin some environmental review, long-term planning work on a solar ordinance. I felt it very important to be addressed as part of addressing this economic development question, and also very important in terms of just being consistent with our values. It seems to me kind of crazy about that it's something that we preach about all the time, and yet it's something that we don't permit. Supervisor Hartman.
I just wanted to chime in, and that is, I think we've begun our clean energy roadmap here in South County through CSD. Where can we find demand response? Where can we find storage? Where can we find more generation? And we've been working on our county facilities, and I think trying to identify other facilities. And now I think the real goal is to take that to North County, and I'm particularly interested in the severe drought that we're still experiencing and what that means to cattle ranches throughout the North County in particular, and whether there would be an opportunity for solar energy in some of those rangelands. But as I understand it, CSD would be doing a study to overlay where are the lands, where is the where are our transmission capabilities and needs, and so that way the county can take on some of the environmental review instead of pushing that off onto individual ranchers. So I'm very supportive of this because I live next to a lot of rangeland, and there are very few cows anymore because of there's not much pasture there. So I think this is a way forward, so I'm very supportive of it, along with you, Chair Williams.
So, Mr. Chair, I didn't hear a question in there, but I'm gonna devise one in my head so I can respond to it. We prepared both for the budget workshops and for the budget hearings today with some information for your board. And this shouldn't look new. It's information that we did provide at the budget workshops following the long-range planning work program item on April 3rd. And you can see the third line item is a utility-grade solar ordinance and policy amendments. And based upon my discussions with CSD, I would recommend that we really fund this for fiscal year 1920 because they are doing the feasibility analysis now and site analysis, and until we have that, there's not a whole lot of work for us to do unless you want us to replicate that work, and that doesn't seem particularly efficient. So that was my recommendation on this. I think it's a very important project and one that is worthy but may not be quite timely yet.
Supervisor Hartman.
Well, I did inquire a bit about this, and while it may take 6 to 9 months for CSD to do theirs, we could get it launched, then at least get it started through P&D. And for me, this is a huge priority, like cannabis was. I mean, I think it's got tremendous potential for us to generate revenue, so I'd like to get it started.
Yes, I think that to Ms. Black's point, we may not need full funding in this fiscal year, but I do think that partial funding in this fiscal year to start it, whether that's in 6 months or in 9 months, I think is pretty important to do. Yes, Ms. Black.
Mr. Chair, so on the slide, you can see that we provided both costs for doing this work in-house and costs if a consultant did these projects. And just to really quickly go through this slide, the ag tiered permitting project is already in our work program, so there's no need to fund that particular line item. The next two, Union Valley Parkway and the utility grade solar, are not. And you can see that if we were to start both of those projects this year and did those in-house, that would take 1.5 FTE that I don't have. If we were to do those outside with a consultant, then the project costs are a little bit higher. And then I've added some information about short-term rentals. But all of those projects, aside from the agricultural tiered permitting project, are outside of the scope of the current long-range planning work program.
And you've hit the nail on the head why I feel like it needs to be budgeted this year, because if it's not, then you won't have it as an FTE, and then there'll be further delay caused by how long it takes to staff up. So that to me is really quintessentially why we need to budget something, so that you know that you've got it as a board priority and that you can hire somebody so it costs us less money than if we go out to consultants. Supervisor Wolf.
Well, you know, obviously the whole issue of solar has been a priority for me, and I think this board, and I'm not really clear, just like I mentioned about the hydrology study, I'm not totally clear what is involved in the utility grade solar ordinance. And I guess I would be a little reluctant, I mean, especially given what you just said, and I don't really even know what is behind this, but we just heard from you that CSD, that there's a step process. So I'm not sure why we would, and I guess we'll get to this when we're talking about our budget priorities, why we would do that or allocate funds for that if, just given what you said, there's a process and that it can be funded in another year. I don't know why we would necessarily do it now. Plus, I don't really know even what the project is. So, thank you.
Well, I just say that this is something that we've talked about before. We've talked about it at least as much as Union Valley Parkway. And I think that's another economic development question, too, that
Don't lump mine in with your controversial one. Mine's a slam dunk.
Well, and I don't know who you're talking to, Doss, because this is, I know that we've talked about
Supervisor Wolf, it's okay to interrupt me for a joke, but not okay to interrupt me with a counterpoint before I've made my point initially.
Doss,
really,
you're really trying.
I have not even made my point here. So can you wait to make your counterpoint till after I make my point?
Doss, of course I will wait. I wish that you would give me the same respect that you are asking me to give to you. I am trying to respond to something that I brought up, and I'm telling you that I don't know what you are talking about, and I'm trying to explain what I do know. And, you know, it's interesting, you keep cutting me off, but when you want to speak, you have the floor and you can go on for as long as you want. And I've never said you need to stop talking. So please allow me the courtesy to speak when I am questioning something that's up on the board.
Supervisor Wolf, I did not know that you had additional questions. I thought she just asked you. Okay, well, I thought she just looked at you and asked if you had additional questions, and you said no. So I am making my point now, which is simply that I do think it's something we've talked about. It's not a late hit, and there's a lot at stake. When what will happen for the South Coast is that the SCE and the PUC have put out a request for proposal for preferred resources. That is renewable projects in small amounts. There's not enough projects getting out there and getting interconnection requests for that to happen. And so, you know, I think it's really important, unless the South Coast wants to get saddled with another natural gas power plant to be refired, we need to have a plan. And unless we want to allow it to continue, that solar is essentially illegal in our county, which I find just from a values perspective totally unacceptable, then we need to have a plan. And that, in my mind, that plan has got to mean utility scale solar, because a lot of us on the South County kind of like to live in la-la land and like to believe that there's going to be enough cumulative on rooftops to meet the energy demand. And that has not been borne out by fact. And so if we want the PUC to accept renewable as the solution here, we've got to have something that might add up to enough megawatts for them to believe that it's possible. And thus far, what is not materializing is enough small distributed generation projects to meet the demand. And so I just think there's a lot at stake here. And I also think it's about our values and whether we really consider economic development to be important. And you know, it's impossible to tell the PUC or SCE or a solar developer that you can do solar here when they read our ordinances and they say, no, we can't. Supervisor Adam.
Well, I'm just going to make an objection to this discussion because, you know, this is why we have D items, and they come back with a nice board letter and some colored glossy photos, and we get to really get down in the details on this. And you know, we're talking about policy considerations, especially in light of the fact that there's specific questions about what this project is that we would be funding. And, you know, this is one of those things that you put a D item out there and you get the votes and you instruct the CEO and her staff to load it into the budget, and then it's there. You know, we had a pregnant idea last time, but nobody told CEO to put it in her budget, and frankly, maybe the money doesn't exist. So, you know, maybe we have to have another D item, and maybe it is next year. And we're kind of this is there's a lot of points on this that I would sort of like to debate about, but in light of the fact that this is a budget hearing, I just feel like it's inappropriate, and you know, such as what good is a solar plant if you don't have power in the evening? You know, I think the hole in our power scheme at this point seems to be in the off-peak, you know, nighttime hours. So I think those are considerations that we need to hear about, and that should be part of the greater discussion, and not just try and shoehorn this thing in at this point in the budget. I think this is an inappropriate time to be doing this.
Well, I think it's an economic development project as valid as the Union Valley Parkway, and I think we've talked a lot about this when long-term planning came with their work plan. That is the bottleneck for getting things done in this county. If you guys want to do something about economic development, that means we need to get more resources into long-term planning. We need to staff up long-term planning, because almost everything we could do on economic development requires environmental review. I wish it wasn't so, but that's the way it is. And I think if you guys want Union Valley Parkway, I think it's just as valid to be asking that we should start another economic development move in legalizing solar in this county. Supervisor Wolf.
No comment.
Supervisor Adam?
Well, you know, economic development is, in my opinion, the problem that we've had with economic development is that we really don't want it, and you know, now we're trying to pick and choose the little pieces that we'd like to have hither and yon, and not making a concerted decision to take all of the above economic development. And you know, I've long said that you know, we just don't want economic development. You know, really, truly, we don't want economic development, because you know, you can't pick who you want to come to your county and do a business. You know, what we need is business. You know, and if some of it's lower paying jobs and some of it's higher paying jobs, you also need to build executive housing in the North County. You know, we keep focusing all of our efforts on low income housing, and that's great, but you know, there's got to be some place for the people who run these businesses that you want to attract to live, and you know, there just isn't that much of that type of housing up there. So those are the kind of things I think we need to think about in the future and be a little bit more open to down the road. But you know, these are, again, policy considerations for D items in the future, I think, you know, and not trying to shoehorn them into the budget.
I think my only point, Mr. Adam, is that it was discussed along with the other long-term planning projects. It shouldn't be a late hit.
Okay.
And I don't disagree with your points about that we are far too selective about what kind of economic development we're willing to have, and that is a conscious decision, and on some, and some it's been an unconscious decision. And I think one of the things today is about re-examining that. And I think, but part of re-examining that is not opening the floodgates in long-term planning, but maybe biting off a little bit more than we are currently, because that is not a whole lot's going to happen in economic development if we don't tackle more things in our work plan and long-term planning. Okay, Supervisor Adam?
Yeah, just one final word on this UVP thing. Just as a side note, 155,000, I mean, this is literally a line on a map, and it's a really tiny short line, too. I don't know how we get 155,000 on that item.
Okay, with that, we're going to go to lunch for 40 minutes. We'll be back.
you.